right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to Thought Adventure Podcast. We finally made it, whether you guys like it or not. We're here. We're having some technical difficulties with mics and all kind of stuff. By the way, Abdulrahman said my voice sounds a bit low. So people in the chat, let me know if you guys are able to hear me okay, or if my voice is very low for you too, because then that would mean that it's my mic. But anyway, so we're here. Might as well just kick right into it. For those who don't know, a little while ago, the last stream that we did actually on Tap, we had a debate. Well, I had a debate with Dr. Bo Branson, who's an Orthodox Christian, and it was between Bo and myself. And so today we're here to review that topic at the request of many people who are requesting a review on the discussion. So that's what we're going to do. But how are you doing, Abdulrahman?
I'm doing good, and your voice is much better right now because I figured it out on my wife's annoying Google Chrome. I just don't know how to use these, but now your voice is good.
Okay, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, so I think we should start off, talking about what the debate is about, the background, and the back and forth you guys had in the past. So there's a bit of context to it. So you want to say something about that?
Yeah. And by the way, if you're watching this and you haven't watched the debate yet, then I mean, it's kind of silly because it's a review. But the exact topic of the debate was: is it impossible to have the divine nature without aseity? And Bo was actually arguing that yes, it is possible, and I was arguing no, it's not possible, it's impossible. Now, let me give a little bit of background of why this is important and what is this discussion really about. Well, Bo is coming from a Trinitarian Christian point of view, in which he believes that there's one God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they all have the same divine nature, meaning whatever it takes in order to be God, all three of the persons possess that. The issue comes in with a property called aseity, which just means to have existence in and of yourself, to be independent, or in Islamic context, what it says in Surah Ikhlas, Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad. To be a samad is to be independent of anything else. So basically, in this debate, we're arguing, in order to be God, do you need to be a samad? Trying to put it in terms that maybe Muslims may understand a bit better. And he's saying, no, you don't have to be independent and have aseity in order to have the divine nature or in order to be God. And the reason is because, classically speaking, at the First Ecumenical Council, which was Nicaea in 325, the Christians declared a doctrine which is basically called the eternal generation of the Son, or the idea that the Son is, in the phraseology of the Creed, eternally begotten, or begotten before all ages by the Father. And how many early 4th and 5th century and onwards church fathers understood this, which Bo was defending as far as he sees it, and I agree with him, the historic Christian position is that the Son is caused to exist eternally by the Father. And what that basically means is a dependency relationship, that the Son, although he's eternal, and whether or not that makes sense, that's a question maybe we'll look at later, but he's eternal, but he's eternally dependent upon the Father, and the Father is not dependent upon the Son. Okay, so this is the position. Obviously, as Muslims, we would disagree with that. We would say, no, in order to have the divine nature or in order to be God, you can't be a dependent being. Okay, so that's the reason for having the debate. Now, I had an informal debate, you could say, or discussion with Bo sometime last year on a different YouTube channel, but you can find the debate posted on my personal YouTube channel as well, Muslim Metaphysician. And it wasn't exactly saying we covered this topic, but we covered a range of other topics. So Bo and I have a history and relationship that I had this discussion with him, and it was related to this subject on last year. And then subsequent to that, I had him on my channel for 2 interviews just to ask him questions. It wasn't a debate or anything. And then after that, he actually made a full length presentation, which was, how long was that video? That was about almost 3 hours long, in which he was discussing something related to this debate. And he called that talk, Does God Have to Have a Son? Or is it necessary for God to have a son? In that video, he mentioned me by name several times. And so several of the points in there, it wasn't specifically just for me, but it was addressing our previous conversation that we would had last year. And then after that, and speaking to Bo more, he asked me if I would have a debate on this specific issue, and that's how we wound up having the debate. So that's the basic context. Obviously, we can go into much more detail, but Abdulrahman, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that part.
Yeah, so I think this is crucial because a lot of people watching the debate kind of had the impression that the discussion was being had in a vacuum, almost as if it's like a topic that's fresh in the context of the discussions you guys had in the past, and right now you need to build a case from the ground up, and so does he. But then the idea is there was a lot of context to it, right, over the past year or so, right? And you approached it like as more of a continuation of those discussions, of the first discussion you guys had. That was a very good discussion, and of the other presentation that Dr. Bo did, which was a very good presentation as well. So the idea was to like from your perspective, which is definitely, I think, understandable, is that you're approaching the discussion in that context as a continuation of those discussions, and you have your mind sort of like fixated on his argument, because as it should be, because I mean that those are the implications. Everybody knows the implication. At least the two of you know the implications of this debate in terms of his further modal argument for the necessity of the sun. So that's kind of what you had your eyes on. But it's almost as if Dr. Bo, I don't know, he was like in his responses to you, it seemed like, we'll get into that, of course, but it seemed like he was expecting you to just erase all that history and sort of argue your case independently of everything that was said. So I think that's an important point that we should keep in mind.
Yeah, and somebody's asking if you have blue eyes in the chat or if they're hallucinating. No, he has blue eyes.
They're kind of,
Yeah.
I don't know if they're bluish greenish, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so we're not going to play. It's not like we're going to be going through the entire video and playing segments of it. If you're watching this now or later on, you should obviously watch the debate first and then come here for further context to understand some of the points better. But anyway, so we're going to kind of try to work through the debate in stages as best we can. I started off with my opening statement, which was 20 minutes long. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go through the main points that I had made in that, which first I started off by explaining some of the key terms in the debate, because obviously if we're asking, is it possible, sorry about that, 1 second. Basically, do you have to have aseity in order to have the divine nature? Well, we need to know what possibility we're talking about, what aseity means, and what the divine nature is, right? So I explained those terms. Now, aseity, I already explained it. It just basically means to be uncaused or independent, to not be dependent on anything other than yourself. And so that's pretty straightforward. And then the other point that I was addressing was the nature. So what is the divine nature? Now, this is obviously could be, is hotly debated what a nature is and what the divine nature would be. But I, for the sake of the debate, just went ahead with Bo's understanding and definition of what a nature is. And Bo basically used the Aristotelian definition. So I'll just briefly read that out just because it's relevant directly to this part of it. So Bo uses Aristotle's definition. 1 second here. Let me just see if I can find the quote. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So Aristotle defines nature as a principle or cause of being moved and of being at rest in that to which it belongs primarily or in virtue of itself and not accidentally. So my understanding of that had to do with causal powers, and that led to one of the arguments that I wound up using in my opening statement. But before I get to that, the other key important term that I defined was possibility. Now, there are different types of possibilities. So there's what's called logical possibility, metaphysical possibility, epistemic possibility. There are all these different types of possibilities. And so I defined some of them and I explained what was the one that I was focusing on, which was metaphysical possibility, right? So logical possibility basically just has to do with whether or not a proposition is consistent with the laws of logic. So just if it can express it and it's not doesn't express a formal contradiction. A proposition is metaphysically possible if it exists in at least one possible world, or that it's consistent with the laws of metaphysics, which I was trying to argue that no, the divine nature and God not being Aseity is not consistent with the laws of metaphysics. So that was kind of my whole argument. And then the other categories of possibility, whatever, there are numerous ones, but just know that I was focusing on metaphysical possibility and whether or not this can actually exist in reality, right? Not in some kind of, abstract type of questioning. So those were the main terms that I went through and defined. And then I went into three main arguments that I had in my opening statement. But before I go to those, Abdulrahman, do you want to comment on any of those definitions or anything like that?
Yeah, so it's important just to clarify to those maybe who might be less familiar that the significance of this is that you see, when you talk about logical possibility, it simply means something that is consistent with the laws of logic. Obviously, something that doesn't entail a contradiction. So, of course, you can come up with all kinds of ridiculous, conceptions of things that are logically possible. But the idea is, and by ridiculous, I wasn't like I'm not talking about Bo's position. I'm just talking about how logical possibility is just like kind of like trivial in that sense. So anything that simply doesn't entail a contradiction is logically possible. Now, the fact that metaphysical possibility or metaphysical modality is the one in question here is a very, very significant point, because even the way the modal ontological argument or ontological arguments in general are discussed is just never going to be in the context of mere possibility, right? As in mere logical possibility. As in, you can present it like that, but then, and Dr. Bo definitely knows this, the back and forth that's going to be had with the atheist or whoever is on the other side is going to be in the context of metaphysical possibility. And I mean, for that reason, I mean, the modal ontological argument is considered by many, even those who accept it, and Plantinga himself alludes to this, that it is only helpful for somebody who already believes that God exists. But I mean, that point aside, the idea is you need to show that something is not merely logically consistent in the sense that it doesn't entail a strict formal A and not A, but what you need to show in terms of metaphysical possibility is much more than that, specifically in the context that Dr. Bowe speaks through, which is the modal ontological argument, and you need to show that basically God so in the first argument that we all kind of agree on the conclusion, not necessarily the process. That's another issue. But what you need to show is that God exists in a possible world. It basically adds up to that, because what does it mean that it's possible for God to exist? Well, that simply means that there is a possible world where God exists. Now, all the atheist has to do is to say that, well, look, there is this possible world where God doesn't exist. And on that basis, there's going to be someone, there's going to need to be a tiebreaker, because by the atheist asserting that there is a possible world where God does not exist, that means God doesn't exist necessarily, right? It's impossible for God to exist because a necessary being either exists in all possible worlds or no possible worlds. So it's that significant. And now the theist here, like the move the theist makes here, isn't simply, oh no, there's no logical contradiction, right? So game over, checkmate, atheist. No, there's a lot more work that's done there. And Dr. Branson, I think definitely should be or is familiar with this.
Yeah, definitely. So then after I defined those terms and went through some of these points, I gave three main arguments. Now, before I get into the arguments, leading off of what Abdulrahman just said, and I think even Bo himself had a little bit of confusion about what my arguments were attempting to show. My arguments were attempting to show that not only Bo's position, but meaning Bo's larger worldview, because he seemed to think that I was just attacking, these attacks were just specific to Bo. Well, not necessarily. What I was trying to show is anyone who takes Bo's position that aseity is not a property of the divine nature, and that you can be divine or have the divine nature and be God without aseity. My arguments were meant to show that the entailments of this would lead to either contradiction or a rejection of a previous principle, something like the PSR or other metaphysical principles that Bo and the common theist would accept that get you to God's existence. And then when you get there and embrace Bo's position, there would be a conflict. So it was meant to show that entailments of Bo's view, and when I say Bo's view, I don't mean as specifically Orthodox Christian with all of his little specific things. No, it was meant to show that anyone who takes his view is going to wind up in some sort of problem. Now, the reason why I focus specifically after mentioning that on things related to Bo's views specifically is because that's who I'm debating. I'm debating Bo Branson. I'm not debating William Lane Craig or James White, who I've debated, or anybody else. I'm debating Bo Branson. Okay, so this needs to be very clear, because there was a lot of confusion about that. I don't know if there's anything you want to say on that, Abdulrahman, before I go into these three arguments here.
Yeah, so the whole worldview thing, I think that's important as well. So I think what you're saying is right, in the sense that I mean, it's important who you're debating, right? Well, I mean, it's almost as if Dr. Branson wanted to be like, ignore my worldview, and you build an independent case for this impossibility. But the reason it's, that's even like more problematic than it actually would be, is because, well, I mean, Dr. Branson knows that he himself builds his case, right, in consideration of what the theist believes. So he says that, well, hey, as a Muslim, you believe that every contingent being or every limited being is, ab alio, or is caused, is dependent. So let's put that part aside, and then let's move on. So he also takes in consideration what you believe. As in, if you come up and say that well, no, I believe in Aseity contingent things. Dr. Bro, based on the responses he's been giving, is going to be like, well, as a Muslim, you don't want to make that move. So he too is taking your position into consideration, and he does that even in the previous discussion. So it's weird that right now in the debate, he's saying, well, and he puts it in a way that, like, you know, like, my worldview is incoherent. Let's just assume that for the sake of argument, as if to show that everything you're saying is completely irrelevant, when he himself relies on the shared agreement that he has with the theist or with the Muslim in order to build his case anyway. So it's got that was a bit strange for me.
Yeah. So anyway, let's go into, so my first argument, which I called the nature of nature's argument. The idea behind this was based on how Bo was defining what a nature was, which had to do with the intrinsic causal powers. I said that Bo's position would show that the Father and Son couldn't possibly have the same divine nature because they don't have the same causal powers. One, Bo's position is that the Father alone has the ability to cause or produce another divine person, meaning to say that the Father alone can cause the Son and the Holy Spirit, and the Son cannot cause a fourth divine person or the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit can't cause another divine person. Only the Father alone has this unique ability. Likewise, the Son alone has certain unique abilities. It is only the Son who can become incarnate. The Father cannot become incarnate. Okay? So the Father and Son, and specifically the first one, I think is even more significant because it's more related to this specific debate, do not seem to have the same causal powers. So given how Bo defines what a nature is, it's difficult to see how the Father and Son could have the same divine nature. Now, this isn't just merely an attack on Bo's view, meaning to say, well, if you take a Catholic view that you believe, well, the Son actually does have the ability to produce another divine person, and he takes part and he's a co-cause in the, producing of the, or spirating of the Holy Spirit, it doesn't change anything, because if that's the case, then it's going to wind up in an infinite regress, which I discuss in another argument. And well, not in another argument, it's basically related to this, because there are a number of different options. However, within those different options, you have a problem any way you go. I just specifically focused on Bo's position within that umbrella because that's why I'm debating. I'm not debating all these other people. But I clearly mentioned in the debate, the different positions that could result from how you answer this question. And either way you go, you're going to have a serious problem. So one of those, which I basically mentioned, was, look, if the Son or the Holy Spirit have the ability to cause another divine person, then that would then mean that you would wind up with an infinite amount of persons. There would be no way to stop the process of the Son causing a fourth divine person and the Holy Spirit causing a fifth divine person, and so on and so on and so on. And so you would wind up with this infinite causal regress of divine persons, which is contradictory and problematic. So Bo knows that, and so therefore he rejects. That's one of the reasons why he takes the Orthodox position and rejects that the Son and the Spirit can have the ability to produce other divine persons. Now, the other option is to say that no, they don't have the ability to cause another divine person, because it's going to result in that problem. But now that means that the Father has unique causal powers that the Son and the Spirit don't. And given how Bo defines what a nature is, that it has to do with its intrinsic causal powers, then that calls into question whether or not the Son and Spirit can have the same nature as the Father. So this was the main thrust of the argument, and what I was trying to explain. Obviously, I'm going to go into other points related to this argument But I don't know if you want to comment now and add anything to that, Abdulrahman.
Yeah, I kind of do. Sorry. So if we need to move on, just let me know. But then so
No, go
so
ahead, bro.
so yeah, the idea is that I mean that's his view of natures, right? Which you were adopting as well, even though you could have just you could have just rejected it, and that could have been the argument. But you did adopt certain uh, 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 views that he has in order to move forward with the discussion. Of course, you accepted them for the sake of argument. Now, the idea is that I mean, he what you're trying to say is very straightforward. What you're trying to say is that, well, based on this view, right, of natures, if there's going to be this, intrinsic causal ability that is part of the nature, if that's the way you define nature, even though there can be exceptions, but then if it is, well, it's going to result in an infinite number of beings. So that's not possible. And what he wants to come in and say, which you take into consideration as well in your opening statement, is that, well, it can be intrinsic and accidental to the nature, right? But then what's he doing there? Right there, he's doing metaphysics, right? He's saying, well, I have to have this specific type of causal capacity, and it has to be extrinsic to the nature in order for this thing to be possible. Otherwise, I end up with an infinite number of divine persons, which is impossible. So right now, I have to, talk about this causal capacity that is intrinsic, accidental to the nature, and it's a very specific kind. And I have two very specific kinds in order not to result in an infinite a number of persons. And well, you're basically saying, wait, I can do that at the very first step. I can do that. I can say that it's an intrinsic causal capacity. Well, it's part of the nature. It's going to be an infinite number of divine beings or divine persons, or it's going to be like a limited number or an arbitrary number, which as well, that's just going to be unexplained and unnecessary. Like, why? And I have the simpler view that no, it's just one divine person. That's all that's possible. And it's strange that I don't know if you realize in his response he was saying something like that there are only those two options, right? There's the infinite option. So Jake is saying, well, it's either an infinity or the Orthodox view. Well, okay, it's the Orthodox view. No, you weren't saying that. You were saying it's either the infinite or the Orthodox view, which is an arbitrary number that requires some kind of explanation, and you just filling
or
the gap.
my view.
yeah, you just filling the gaps with these theologically motivated mysterious causal abilities that we don't even know what they are really, is not going to help. And in relation to that, the third option here, which is what I'm proposing, the one divine person and the impossibility of a second, seems to be the option to go with. So it's not just those two options; it's the third, simpler and more straightforward one, right? So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and so the three options that I set out, which I clearly said in my opening statement. So let me actually see if I could read a section from it. You know what? I don't want to waste time and trying to find it. But what I basically said is, look, you're going to wind up with, okay, here I said there seems to be only three options available in this scenario. Either there's only one divine person, which is my view, to use Christian language, that's our view. There is a plural arbitrary number of divine persons, which I'm arguing is Bo's view, or there is an infinite number of divine persons. So I didn't give an argument just to say that this argument is only specific to Bo's view. I said, here are the list given how Bo defines what a nature is, and you can have two options that the power to cause another divine person, that God doesn't have it at all, which would be our position, because for us that's contradictory to say that God could cause another divine person because God is uncause. So the first option is he doesn't have that quote unquote power. That doesn't mean he's lacking something. It just means it doesn't make sense for God to be caused. He's not defined that way, which that's our position. Now, the other two live options for Bo would be it is a personal property of the Father, right? In order to cause another divine person, which is his position, or it's a intrinsic property of the nature, which is shareable. That's the third option. This is a full taxonomy of the different views. Bo doesn't accept my view, right? So I'm obviously arguing for it, but he doesn't accept my view, so we can leave that out. So the two other options for somebody who wants to take the view that it's possible to have another divine person without aseity, one would be either it's a power to cause another divine person is intrinsic to the nature. If that's the case, it leads to an infinite amount of divine persons, which Bo himself admits is wrong. Okay, so I clearly said that. That's one option. That's off the table. And he believes that the Catholic position actually results in that. So all the Catholics out there listening, watching that, he thinks that your position results in an actual infinite amount of divine persons, which is impossible. So once we push that aside, now it's my view left, or what he considers the Orthodox view. Now what he's saying is, no, the power to produce another divine person is an intrinsic, is a property of the person of the Father, not of the divine nature, right? But then my argument is, well, based on how you define natures and how we understand and are able to distinguish what natures are one from another, and I gave the example of a flame. If a flame has the ability to ignite something else, right, and it causes two other flames to exist, but those two quote unquote flames do not have the ability to ignite anything else, then it'll be strange. Well, why do we have this fire that seems to have propensity or nature to be able to burn things, but yet these other two flames, although they look similar, mysteriously don't have the ability to be able to do that, right? So that on the face of it seems to be problematic, given how Bo defines what a nature is, how if they lack that property to cause another divine person and that power, how they would be able to have the same divine nature. Then even if we go beyond that and say, okay, that let's say that Bo's position, let's go ahead with it. I'm saying that when you move that second step further, the question is, why are there only three divine persons? In other words, why does the Father only cause two divine persons? Because you say, well, we don't get four because, or we don't get an infinite number because the Son and the Spirit don't have the ability to produce another divine person. But then my question is, you wind up with an arbitrary number of divine persons, three. So what is the necessary explanation or entailment relation for why you only have three divine persons? And this is what I was pressing on, because if you reject one and you reject infinite, then why is three the magic number? And why I pressed on this is because if there are an arbitrary number of divine persons, then we can shave those off, and we know through contingency-based arguments, which I think Bo even agrees with, is that one of the ways that we identify that something is contingent is the fact that it's arbitrarily limited in a way that calls out for an explanation. So if it calls out for an explanation, the Son and the Holy Spirit, as to why there are three, and yet there is no explanation for it based on laws of metaphysics rather than scripture and tradition, then it seems that your argument can no longer be satisfied purely from a philosophical perspective, right? And so when I push on this, which I did in our previous debate the first time, I said, well, how is three the magic number? And he appealed no longer at that point to a philosophical argument, but had to say, and he didn't even go into it really in this debate much, that the second divine person and the third divine person are possible, but the fourth one is not, because the Father only has two types of causation. So you have this thing which is begetting, and you have this thing which are spirating, of which it's not clear to us even what these quote unquote types of causation are in the first place. They're not well defined. And second, there's no clear definition and discernment between the two. In fact, he said in the previous debate, quoting Saint Gregory, that it has been revealed to us that there is a difference between the begetting and the spirating, but it has not been revealed to us what the difference is. So if you don't even know by revelation what the metaphysical distinction is between begetting and spirating, how would you provide an a priori argument based on the laws of metaphysics to establish that there is no, for example, to establish a difference, a meaningful difference between them, and to stop the process to show why I can't posit a third type of causation and a fourth type of causation. And that's the point, is that Bo's position, if you reject the single divine person, fine. If you reject the infinite divine person, amount of divine person, fine, I agree with that. But then you're telling us three, but you have no metaphysical or a priori philosophical justification for the necessity of only three divine persons, and therefore it's an arbitrary amount which calls out for an explanation, but shows that in fact these other divine persons are contingent. So this is the full explanation of what the argument is. As far as I can tell, I mean, we'll get to Bo's opening statement and his rebuttals, but I don't think he really responded to that. He just made it seem like, well, I'm just attacking Bo's view specifically. No, I'm giving a full taxonomy of the different positions available. I'm saying you reject mine. Here are the two other positions available. You reject the infinite number of divine persons. And so now I'm attacking, which I agree with, and now I'm attacking your view specifically and showing that it can't be defended from purely metaphysical means. You need to appeal to tradition. And even when you appeal to tradition at that point, Gregory says that it hasn't even been revealed to us what the difference is between these types of causation. So anyway, that's a detailed explanation, I think, of the first argument. Is there anything you want to add to what I've said now, Abdulrahman?
Yeah, I think based on some comments, just one very quick thing, because some people are confused about this arbitrary limits thing, right? And the idea is not that you can't have any like theologically revealed like doctrines that give you information about God that isn't necessarily arrived at through rational means. It's not like nothing further can be said through revelation about God that isn't strictly arrived at through rational means. That's not the idea. The idea is that if this is a philosophical argument, and specifically for Dr. Branson, who says that everything you know about God you need to know a priori, right? If this is a philosophical argument and you are sort of like comparing models, then a bit abstractly, apart from theological commitments, then, well, you don't want to bring in the theological commitments and build your philosophical case, which is supposed to be a priori, on those theological commitments. So the idea isn't that you can't have theological commitments. The idea is that they're irrelevant in that discussion, because just as you can have a theological commitment that solves the problem for you and renders the possibility of a non-Aseity divine being by this mysterious causal ability that is accidental to the nature, well, someone else can have a theologically revealed understanding of God that says that causal ability doesn't exist. I mean, you could have two types of causality, or you could have no type of causality that brings in a divine being that needs something else to bring him into existence in order for the divine being to exist. So the idea is this problem needs to be solved in the discussion. That was Jake's point, that, well, we need to talk about this infinite number. No, we both agree that's not possible. Okay, so what's going to limit it? Now let's talk about that. Now, what can Dr. Branson say that would render it possible? He has to appeal to something that is extrinsic and as he admits, kind of mysterious, as far as what type of causality it is concerned. Well, Jake can equally bring in a theological commitment that there is no type of causality that can bring in a necessary being who.
Yeah, I think this comment is relevant because he's saying, I fail to see the force of the argument. There's no logical reason for the Islamic God to have his particular characteristics. We all just accept that some things just are without explanation. That's the point. You're just accepting that there is no explanation. We're not accepting that there's no explanation. That you have to understand that this discussion is in the context of metaphysics. So you need to admit, if you cannot establish, we don't argue for particular attributes that God has from the Islamic tradition purely by rational means. We don't do that. We believe that there are certain attributes we can prove God's existence, and there are certain attributes that we can prove through the intellect or reason alone, but we do believe in sifat or attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we know through the text. And there's no problem with that. However, those are not directly related to the discussion that we're having here. What Bo is talking about, these principles or things that are known through tradition and whatever, are directly related to the subject matter, because those are the very things that are doing the limiting to get around the argument, right? So it's not analogous to using that in a discussion here versus explaining that, of course, I believe in certain attributes that are revealed in Scripture that are not known through the intellect. So, I mean, honestly, if you can't see the difference between the two, then that's whatever. We can't waste too much time on the comments going back and forth. But is there anything else you wanted to say on that first argument before we go to the second one? Abdulrahman? No? Okay. So, okay, that's fully fleshed out what the first argument was. And the reason why we're spending so much time on my arguments is because Bo didn't really, I mean, and this is not an attack on him necessarily, but he didn't really provide many positive arguments. And in his mind, he didn't think that he had to. Fair enough. So we're going to spend most of the time breaking down my arguments, and then we'll see what his response to these three arguments were. So my second argument I called the father-cow objection. And it was not meant as a disrespect, and I don't think Bo took it that way. But what the argument was meant to show was that under Bo's conception, there doesn't seem to be really anything specific about the divine nature that entails aseity. So if there's no entailment, if aseity is not a property of the divine nature and there's no necessary entailment relation from the divine nature for the being that possesses it to have aseity, then the whole question is, well, why is God ase rather than a cow? Meaning, okay, I mean, there's nothing so special that entails the divine from the divine nature to have aseity. So why can't we have an ase cow? And part of it is to be provocative in order to both be clear on why he thinks a cow can't be ase, but he thinks that God can, but doesn't necessarily have to be so, right? So this was the second argument that I was making is, why isn't it possible for a cow to be ase, given Bo's commitments and how he explains what natures are, that the nature has nothing to do with whether or not something is ase or is not ase, right? So Abdulrahman, I don't know if you want to comment on this argument here.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Dr. Branson tries to say that it follows from his PSR, but then again, well, what PSR? So it feels like he just doesn't want to go back to any of like the prior commitments that he has, and maybe we share and kind of deconstruct them and see, well, why we believe these things, which was part of your approach. Like, it's like you're saying that we're starting off with I mean, Dr. Bo is saying that we're starting off with this common ground, and that we accept a specific argument, or we have a certain theological, common ground. Although he was, trying to say that let's just put all that history aside in this discussion. But anyway, he is coming from that angle, and you're saying, well, based on what you're saying here, we can just take a few steps back and look at our prior commitments and see, well, why do we believe these things? And he just wants to say, like, the impossibility of an ase cow follows from the PSR, but then what PSR and why? Like that's just insufficient, right? So, I mean, you can't just state it and as though we all agree on these things, right? And assume that the PSR doesn't entail the converse, right? Because maybe the PSR doesn't entail it, but maybe certain arguments, within certain arguments and within certain ontological and cosmological arguments, there are accounts that are provided by many philosophers for ontological accounts for the necessity of God that would include something like what Jake is trying to establish here. I mean, that's kind of his whole point, is that we have these very complex intertwined metaphysical principles. We agree on a lot, but we just don't agree on all the principles. And in a discussion like this, you can't just, throw all that away and in a vacuum say, okay, is it logically possible? And he isn't even doing that because of what we spoke earlier about causality and the other metaphysical baggage that has to be brought in to this second phase argument he's providing.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to entertain all of your guys' comments in the chat just because we have to go through everything. And don't worry, Ortho Bro and some of these guys who are making, to be quite frank with you, silly comments. We'll get to address your points and show why Dr. Bo himself even agreed that his argument didn't work in the cross-examination section. So anyway, the third argument, my third and final argument, was the contingency of the father argument. And this one needs probably the most background for people to actually understand why I was saying this and why I was using this argument. So I was trying to show that Bo's prior position, especially before coming to the debate, which was directly related because he used it as an argument, and I'm going to show that. I'll play it on the screen for people. And honestly, this was one of the things that I felt was quite unfortunate about Bo's approach, which I had messaged him about. I don't think he's replied yet, but hopefully he'll watch this and consider it later, is that I was establishing that Bo's conception of how intrinsic properties work versus extrinsic properties would lead to God being contingent. So even the Father would be contingent. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Bo, in the previous video where he was addressing me and where he was arguing for the necessity of the Son, he used certain criteria for what's called an intrinsic property, right? And we're going to go over that so you'll be able to hear what Bo himself says. Now, based on this categorization of intrinsic properties, I was arguing that Bo's own position would entail that God is contingent. Now, other people who hold to this criteria, such as Jas Sijuwade and even Inspiring Philosophy to a lesser degree, although I don't think he was fully aware of this discussion, but I put it to him and he kind of seemed to biting the bullet and say, well, yeah, God could be contingent. It doesn't seem to really have a problem with that. Both Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones, and Jas Sijuwade both didn't really have a problem with that. But of course, Bo would, because he believes that God is a necessary being. And although he believes that the Son is Aseity, he still believes that he's necessary. So this would literally be an internal contradiction in Bo's view. Now, why do people like Bo and Josh and these other Christians that hold to this position, why do they want to try and prove that aseity is not an intrinsic property? Well, the reason why they want to try to prove this is because they want to say that aseity is an extrinsic property and only intrinsic properties are great making. So a lot of theists, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish people alike, believe that God is perfect, right? So he has attributes of perfection and he's the most perfect being. And there's something which is called perfect being theology, which is based on this concept. And so we attribute things like omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and these type of attributes. And many times you attribute aseity, that it's an attribute of perfection. So if God is perfect, and in order to be God, you must be perfect, you have to have aseity. What they want to respond to this line of argumentation is to say, no, only quote unquote great making properties, or properties that if a being has, it makes him greater or the greatest instead of lacking the property, have to be intrinsic properties. Extrinsic properties are not great making. So what they want to do is, because they say that aseity, that the Son can be God without being Aseity, they have to try to prove that aseity is not an intrinsic property. They want to relegate it to make it an extrinsic property such that it's not great making, and therefore the Son and the Spirit don't need to have aseity in order to be God, because it's not a great making property which they would lack. So that's the whole background to it. Now, in light of that, they use certain criteria from secular naturalist philosophy, which I'm going to show, that was put forward by some naturalist philosophers. And they tried to use that. Josh is the first one I've seen use it. And it seemed like Branson, Dr. Bo seemed to just kind of copy it from Josh's presentation. And he used this in a presentation, in a video, not 10 years ago, less than a year ago, in which he was directly addressing me. So when I went into the debate, I assumed that this was his position. Now, I think it became clear in the debate. I personally believe, either through his own reflection or possibly from seeing my discussion with Josh and being tipped off by others, that he wound up rejecting this he wound up rejecting this criteria because he now realized the problems with it. However, he did present it, and he actually used it as part of his presentation in this other video, which was the last public comments I saw on it. So I just went into the debate assuming that this was his position. Now, this criteria, he actually used it to try to prove that aseity is an extrinsic property rather than an intrinsic property, in order to support the position that the Son could be God without possessing aseity. Now, I'm going to share my screen here, and Abdulrahman, if you want to comment on anything I said thus far before I play the section from his presentation where he outlined this principles and this criteria.
No, I think go for it first, so it can be like just one shot.
Okay. So as you'll see here, I don't know if people can see my screen here. You guys able to see it? Okay. So it says, does God have to have a son? Dr. Bo Branson. Now, this was on the Orthodox Shahada channel, which is where we had our first discussion. And you can see the whole presentation is about almost 3 hours long. In this presentation, Bo actually admits, and you can see this is July of last year, so this was less than a year ago. Bo actually admits that after our initial discussion, he had to reformulate his argument and position in light of my initial criticisms. Okay, so one of the things that he added, and I'm not saying this was added because of my criticism, but one of the things he added to his discussion was this understanding of intrinsic properties. So let's listen to what he says, and he seems to think it is important in this discussion.
Kind of get all this just jumbled confusion. But philosophers get all these terms, and so I say let's help them out by just making some connections here. So I'm going to make some little clarifications here.
So notice what he says. He says, let's actually help philosophers out, and he's kind of giggling about it, by making some clarifications here. Okay, and listen to what the clarifications are.
So first of all, let's just talk about what an intrinsic property is. To say that a property is intrinsic requires all of the following. It has to be possible that there's a lonely X such that X has that property. A lonely X just meaning, imagine a possible world where there's only this one individual, or at least there's only this one contingent individual or something. If numbers are necessary beings or something like that. Imagine there's a world with just this one contingent concrete individual. Could it have X? Could it lack X? And then now imagine that individual exists accompanied by other beings. So they're in a world that has other beings besides them. Could it have X and could it lack X? So a property is intrinsic only if all of those are possible. That there could be a lonely thing that has it. There could be a lonely thing that lacks it. There could be an accompanied thing that has it. There could be an accompanied thing that lacks it. In other words, F is it's an intrinsic property only if it's independent of loneliness and accompaniment. Doesn't matter whether it's lonely or accompanied. You could have it either way. So think about something like being shaped, being round shaped, right? You could be round if you were the only thing that existed, and you can be round if there's other things that exist, right? You can be round either way, and you could be something other than round. You could be square alone or with other things. So your shape is going to be intrinsic. Your color is going to be intrinsic.
Anyway, I don't want to play the whole thing, but people can go watch it. It starts at about the 58-minute mark of the video, and he discusses it up until, let's see, he discusses it up until about an hour and 10 minutes. So about 12 minutes, he talks about this subject of intrinsic properties, and he goes on to try to prove that aseity is an extrinsic property, not an intrinsic property. In light of that, the Son does not need to be ase in order to be God, because he doesn't need to have this property because it's not great making. This is the whole argument. Now, what I pointed out to Josh previously in Speaker's Corner when I had a discussion with him earlier this year is that this would result in the Father and the Son, all three of them, being contingent. Why? Because this is based on possible world semantics. So as you saw Bo there, and Josh did the same thing as well, they talked about, well, in order to know if a property is intrinsic or extrinsic, you need to fulfill this criteria in order for it to be an intrinsic property. And so they say, well, imagine a lonely rock, a rock that exists alone in some possible world. Well, first off, hold on a second. Are you talking about really possible, really metaphysically possible? If you're talking about in terms of metaphysical possibility, then you're saying that there is literally a possible world in which a lonely rock exists and God does not. That would mean that there's a possible world in which God does not exist. And if that's true, then he's not a necessary being. Alternatively, if you say that, no, what we mean by a lonely object, which Bo kind of hinted at there, is that the lonely object is the only contingent object, right? And what his position is to say, okay, you could have God in that possible world who's the necessary being, so he must exist there. But then you also have this lonely object, which is the rock. And he says, well, would the rock be ase? Or would the cow be ase? And which is, he actually used that example. Well, he says, well, the rock or the cow would have to be ase, meaning not dependent upon anything, because that's what it means for it to be lonely, is that it wouldn't, there's nothing else there for it to be dependent on, and therefore it would have to have aseity. And the criteria for being an intrinsic property is that it has to have the possibility of lacking the property when it is lonely. Now, what they argue is that a rock or a cow that is lonely does not have the ability to lack aseity when it's lonely, because if it's alone, there's nothing for it to depend on, and therefore it would have to be ase. But what that means is one of two options. Either the rock and cow that exists in that possible world, which God also exists, either that would mean that it is a contingent being or it's a necessary being. If that cow, which is ase, is contingent, then that means you have something which is ase and contingent, which is unexplained by God, meaning it's not dependent upon God. So there's a possible world in which God exists, and that rock is not caused to exist or explained by God's existence, which means now you have a contingent thing, which is in a world which God exists, and he's not explaining it, okay? Which is problematic if you're a theist. So Bo wants to bring in considerations about what we believe as theists. Well, that would be problematic to say God exists in the world, and yet you have this other thing, which is ase, which is not dependent upon him. That would contradict his principles as a theist, and mine as well as a Muslim. On the other hand, which is actually Bo's position, because he explicitly says that aseity entails necessity, but necessity doesn't necessarily entail aseity, which means if the rock exists in that possible world and it's ase, then it would be necessary. But now you would have two necessary beings, because you would have God, who's a necessary being, and you would have the rock, which is a necessary being. And now you have two necessary beings in the same world with different natures, which is also a problem because now you have multiple gods, basically. Astaghfirullah, you have the rock, which is a necessary being, right? So either way, you have a serious problem. Now, in light of all of these criticisms, and which Bo, in my opening statement, as I was going through this third argument, he was actually shaking his head in agreement, realizing, okay, yeah, I agree, these are problems. However, when I was bringing it up in the debate, he seemed to be acting oblivious, as if he didn't understand, and this was really disappointing to me, why I was bringing up this objection. Well, Bo, in a video just less than a year ago, when you did almost a 3-hour presentation on a subject related to this topic, trying to prove that aseity is an extrinsic, not an intrinsic property, this was your position. So your position back then would entail that God is a contingent being, or there are contingent things which are unexplained by God, or there are multiple necessary beings, all of which are problematic positions. So there was no public retraction by Bo, no message from Bo, hey, Jake, yeah, I said this before, but I no longer hold this position. So I use this argument as part of the debate because it was relevant. But he seemed to think that it wasn't relevant and acted as if he couldn't understand why I was bringing this up. Well, Bo, I mean, with all due respect, I don't know what happened there, but you should have been a bit more forthright and say, okay, Jake, which he did actually say that he agreed with my third argument and its criticisms. And he actually said, yeah, those are good arguments. That's why I reject that criteria. Well, Bo, you didn't reject the criteria last year, and you used it to argue against my position and anybody that holds my position. So what you should have said, to be honest and forthright in the debate, is, Jake, I understand, an audience, I understand why Jake is making this third argument, because I used to hold this position and I either realized it through myself or somebody told me or saw certain things that Jake said, and I realized that it was problematic, and now I've abandoned that position in light of that. And I could have said, okay, Bo, you've changed your position since the last time you spoke on this subject because you realized the problems that I was pointing out, and okay, now we can focus on the other two arguments. But instead, what he did was kind of act as if he didn't understand why I was bringing it up. Now, if you just watched the debate and you didn't realize that he made a video on this subject where he was using this criteria, which he now says he was rejecting, then you would just say, oh, yeah, why is Jake bringing this point up? Well, because he used it to defend his position previously. And I didn't know that he changed his position. He didn't stay that way. So it kind of made me seem like, oh, well, Jake was bringing up an irrelevant point. No, I wasn't bringing up an irrelevant point. I was bringing up a relevant point directly related to the debate, and Bo should have clarified and said, Jake is bringing up this position because I used to hold that position. I've realized that it's problematic for all of the same reasons and maybe more that Jake is bringing it up, and therefore now I reject that position. So let's focus now on the other two arguments. And that would have been great, but he didn't do that, and I was really disappointed in that because I felt that that was not really transparent. And those who weren't aware of the context of this debate and our previous engagements and what Bo has said publicly on this topic before, they would just watch it and think that, yeah, maybe Jake was bringing up an irrelevant point, or they didn't understand what this issue was about. So, that was the third argument. That's a deep explanation as to what the argument was meant to show, why I brought it up, what the context was, and why it was relevant, and why Bo himself has now had to modify his position again after this debate, because what he previously said, he realized that there were problems with it. And there's no problem. I've changed my positions. There's no problem with that. But you should just be honest about it and say it very clearly in a debate. Don't act like if somebody asked me, well, if somebody asked or was critiquing a position which they assumed I had because it's the last thing that was publicly on record about it, and then I just said, well, I didn't say anything about that in this debate, so why is Johnny bringing it up? Well, Johnny, he knows that that's been your position, so of course it's fair game to bring that up. So anyway, that's the full explanation. Abdulrahman, if you want to comment on anything, the reason why I'm talking so much, especially at this point, is just because I have all the context behind this third argument and why I brought it up. But yeah, I was just disappointed in the way that Bo kind of handled that and acted as if he didn't understand what the relevance was.
No, I'm totally with you. Like, so it seems like a lot, you know, a big part of his case depended on that that criteria, that Langton-Lewis criteria that he appealed to, and then it was as if he never appealed to it in the past, and like he basically built his case for, you know, the fact that Aseity is not an intrinsic property on the fact that it's not. Sorry, he built his case for the fact that Aseity is not a great making property on the fact that it's not intrinsic, and on that he arrived at that conclusion, at least partly by presenting the criteria he presented. So it was obvious that that's the context, right? Now, if that's not, if that isn't the criteria, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that Aseity is intrinsic, but it just means that, well, that point hasn't been established, right? And there's another point about the great making, right? But I don't know if it's relevant to this point, so we can move on maybe with this one. But I was thinking about great making extrinsic properties, but I think that will take us off track. But the whole idea is that if you do present this criteria and build your case on the basis of the criteria in the middle of a back and forth with your interlocutor, right? Then I think it should be a very significant point to bring up. At least it should be acknowledged in the debate that fine, yeah, that criteria wasn't correct. So on that basis, I agree with you. I'll have to retract my statement that Aseity is an extrinsic property because of that, and maybe present a new argument for it. He just said it's analytic, but I just don't think that's satisfactory enough because of you know, the context of the discussions in the past.
Yeah, so that was pretty much it for an explanation of my opening statement. And I think we can move on to Bo's opening statement and, you know, take a look at some of the things that he had to say. So I'm actually going to play a couple clips from the debate because I'm obviously here to give my explanation, but Bo's not. So to be fair, let him explain some of this for himself. Okay. All right. So here we go.
And like I said, there's inductive reasons to think, well, if we don't get a good argument for it, then we're probably not going to be. There's some just purely logical or a priori reasons to question whether we're going to get a good argument for it. And I want you to think, too, as we go through this debate about whether, you know, where do Jake's arguments fit into this kind of category. So one way that you can support a proposition is, as we'd say, a posteriori, meaning after experience or on the basis of experience. So you can do experiments and observations like we do in science, right? For example, we never observed copper that fails to conduct electricity. So it seems like, well, maybe that's just a feature of the nature of copper, right? But of course, it's difficult to say that we know things a posteriori about God, right? There's a lot of difficulties with that, but the most obvious one would be that inductive inferences require many, many instances to confirm them. You have to look at a lot of different bits of copper before you finally feel confident that, well, maybe they just all work the same way. So you would have to look at lots and lots of different gods, right, before you could conclude very, very confidently facts about his nature, at least on the basis of experience. So that would be something I think Muslims and Unitarians would probably not want to do, right? So that's not really going to be a good way to argue. How would you prove something not a posteriori, but a priori, that is prior to experience or without relying on experience? Well, there's a couple of ways to go. Jake mentioned the difference between logical truth. We make a distinction between logical truth, analytic truths, and then truths that are, we might say, synthetic a priori, or truths of metaphysics. A logical truth is one that's just made true in virtue of the logical operators in a statement. So logical operators are words like and, or, not, all, some, none. So if I say if P, then P, that's going to be true. It doesn't matter what P means. It doesn't even matter whether P is true, right? If you say if Muhammad is a prophet, then Muhammad is a prophet. Well, I believe that, right? I believe if he's a prophet, then he's a prophet. It doesn't matter whether he is or not. That statement's going to turn out to be true. But the eunomian premise doesn't have a logical form like that. That's just kind of guaranteed to be true, and it doesn't matter what it means. It has the logical form, it's impossible for X to be both A and B, right? But that's not something that's just logically true, right? It's possible to have two different properties. So the eunomian premise isn't going to be based on experience. It's not going to be just a truth of logic. Another way to prove something a priori would be to say that it's what we call analytic. In other words, true by definition. So that's to say it's not made true by just the logical operators, but in virtue of the definitions of the terms. So if I say it's impossible to be both married and a bachelor, that's not a logical truth. But if I substitute the definition for bachelor, it's going to have the term unmarried in there. So then I'd get a contradiction, right? I'd be saying it's impossible to be both an unmarried male and married. Well, that's right? Because that would be contradictory. So that's one way to prove something a priori, is to say it's just true by definition. I don't think even Jake is going to say that this is just true by definition, right? If so, it would have to fall out of a definition. We would need to know what definition is Jake giving us that somehow entails this claim that it's impossible to have the divine nature but be Aseity. We looked at the definition of nature. It doesn't contain any reference to Aseity. We looked at the definition of Aseity, and it doesn't contain a reference to natures. So it's not going to be an analytic truth either. The only option that's left is that it's a synthetic a priori claim. And sometimes this is kind of how people define metaphysics. Jake talked earlier about the laws of metaphysics. The laws of metaphysics would just be these synthetic a priori claims. The difficulty with synthetic a priori claims is they've puzzled philosophers for centuries, right? So David Hume famously just argued that no such knowledge is possible for humans. Immanuel Kant's entire system of transcendental idealism is just kind of explicitly designed. It's a very famously complicated system. Just try to figure out how we could ever have such knowledge, and it's arguably not very successful even at that. So the difficulty is kind of trying to figure out these kinds of propositions are automatically difficult to know for sure. There's two ways that you might support.
Okay, so basically, I wanted to show Bo giving a breakdown of the different ways he thinks that you can prove something, the different types of the distinction he's making between a priori and synthetic and all these different things. And he's basically saying, which I pretty much agree with him on, that it's going to come down to a synthetic a priori, or dealing with the laws of metaphysics. So we're somewhat agreeing on that. Interestingly enough, some of the Christians in the audience don't seem to think that that's the case, because Bo and I actually agreed on that point, and yet they're asking for where the logical contradiction is, right? But Bo isn't even himself really asking for that, although he seems to proceed in a way that kind of deviates from that. But yeah, so Abdulrahman, what do you think about his breakdown there and what he had to say?
I mean, I think so. I think he's right in a lot of what he's saying, but that's just like I don't really see the point in the sense that he's saying as if this is responding to you. So much of what he's saying is like still in line with your entire presentation, which is fine. But it seems like a great deal of his opening was just spent on like a basics of like an intro to metaphysics class or something, where you were actually operating from that angle, and like you were trying to explore the entailments of our metaphysical commitments, right? So I think I just don't really see the point, because if the arguments you were trying to present were in line with what he was saying, then I guess he just should have responded to your arguments. Now, this thing about everything you can know about God being a priori, of course, is not entirely true. Actually, for a lot of people, it's not true at all, because right? I mean, because we're supposed to, according to Dr. Branson, just put aside, our individual worldviews, like your individual worldviews in the debate, and just I can assume that my worldview is incoherent. Like when he said that, well, Unitarians or Muslims are not going to want to say about like inductively arriving at God. Well, I mean, you could have equally said, well, why? I mean, I can concede that my worldview is incoherent. Now you need to argue your case from the ground up. And then we could just do this all day and like just pretend that there's no context to the discussion altogether. But the idea is, and you pointed this out in the debate, of course, that no, not everything you know about God is a priori. You have things that you get from revelation, for example. There are also arguments for the existence of God, or for certain attributes about God, or stage 2 cosmological arguments, and all the different formulations they come in, that do rely on, let's say, like empirical evidence. So there'll be like an empirical basis through which you'd make an inference, right? And it doesn't really have to be like a sort of instance of many gods for you to infer what there is to know about God when you're providing a comprehensive account or theory of reality, or a metaphysical theory. I mean, so the details there are a lot, but then the assumptions are packed in there. I mean, so just as he's critiquing, like, your position in that, well, you're not really focusing on giving me an argument. You're just arguing for my worldview being incoherent.
Yeah, I'm going to play that clip soon.
Yeah, I mean, you could equally say the same thing. You could say, well, why are we assuming all this stuff? Why are you assuming this agreement, right? Because it's the agreement I was trying to go back to and sort of deconstruct in order to see whether the reason we share these commitments is in line with what you're proposing here about the possibility of the divine being, which again is another point we need to get to, about him saying that he doesn't really have the burden of proof to actually prove that. But the point is to deconstruct some of these points. And a final very important point is that, the fact that you agree on a particular principle, right, or a particular theological or metaphysical commitment, doesn't always mean that you agree on it for the same reason, right? So the fact that we agree on, let's assume we agree on a certain PSR, right? Because he mentioned PSR as if they're all on equal grounding. But let's just assume that for simplicity, we assume we all agree on a particular one that basically makes it possible to make some of these arguments. Well, that doesn't mean that we share similar commitments through which these principles were adopted or derived. That doesn't necessarily follow. So it could be that I believe in something and you believe in the same thing, but I'm completely justified in my belief, where you would be unjustified in your belief regarding the same belief. So all of these points are important, but it doesn't seem like it was being approached in that serious way that you were trying to approach it in the beginning of your opening, trying to break down different types of modalities and try to dissect it in that way. It seems like it was being approached in the sense that, well, you know what, either show me a or not A and not A, or this debate is over. I just don't think that's very serious, because if that's the case, we've never argued that in the first. Like when have Muslims argued that a non-Aseity divine being entails this explicit contradiction, like a proposition and its negation? I mean, haven't really argued like that. Contradictions have been involved. You personally normally do an internal critique in order to bring it to inconsistencies. So if that's the debate, really, it's quite trivial in that sense. And I think you were in line with that consideration from the very beginning.
Yeah. So I'm going to play a clip from his opening statement, which is actually a couple minutes before that one. This is around the 30-minute mark, because when we get into the cross-examination section, I'm going to show that what a lot of people think Bo was actually raising there had nothing to do with what he was saying. And that's going to show, because if that's the case, it would refute his own position. Okay, so here we go.
Not a problem. So it's kind of, it's easy to see why Eunomius's theory didn't work. I mean, another issue is just the strong view of divine simplicity itself seems problematic. It doesn't seem like God's foreknowledge is the same thing as his power, or his justice is the same thing as his mercy, and is the same thing as himself and his act of creation and so forth. Some of those things have to be contingent, like his act of creation, and some are necessary, like his foreknowledge. So it's difficult to see how those would be identical anyway. And like I said, Jake kind of has made it clear why, if this is theologically important. Obviously, if you have this traditional view of the Trinity that you see in the Nicene Creed and the Church Fathers and the Athanasian Creed and others, where the Father is without a source, and then the Son and Spirit have their source in the Father, but they're supposed to have the same nature. Well, the Eunomian premise is just saying that's impossible. So Eunomius's arguments for this proposition were not so hot. Every so often it gets resurrected, sort of, either by Unitarians, like in the 1500s, by Muslims today in analytic philosophy, some actually Trinitarian Christians who kind of have a non-traditional view of the Trinity try to use it. But it's usually just kind of asserted as though it's sort of obviously true.
Anyway, my point there was Bo is actually bringing up Eunomius's argument, which he claims he was primarily arguing based on divine simplicity, that the divine nature just is identical to Aseity, basically. That what it means to be God is to be Ase and nothing else. And it's this radical notion of divine simplicity. Now, I myself reject divine simplicity. Orthodox Sunni Muslims in general reject divine simplicity. However, Bo himself, his own model, and this Cappadocian Eastern model that he's trying to represent, whether he's doing it accurately historical is not my concern, but just know that Bo rejects divine simplicity. Therefore, people who think that he's making some type of composition argument, or when he asking me if God's omniscience is Ase, that he's making some point about that in reference to divine simplicity. No, he's not. Has nothing to do with divine simplicity, because he doesn't believe in divine simplicity. In fact, he was arguing against it there, saying that it doesn't seem to make any sense, which I actually agree with him on that point. So I just wanted to make that clear, because some people think, and which we'll take a look at in a little while, some of the things that he was bringing up or questioning about, they thought that he was making a point related to divine simplicity, which he certainly wasn't. So anyway, what else? Let's see. Hold on. I just want to see if there's much other from Dr. Branson's presentation here. We can take a look at when he claims that I didn't make any argument, right? So that was around 39 minutes and 15 seconds. You can listen to a minute or two there, where he was, even though it's his opening statement, he was kind of replying to what I had said in my opening statement. Okay, which Abdulrahman was alluding to earlier. So here you go.
Hear an argument. I heard sort of objections to different sort of aspects of my broader worldview, whatever. But I didn't hear an argument for the Eunomian claim, right? The Eunomian premise says it's impossible to have the divine nature but not Aseity. And an argument should have premises. They should have a logical form so that those premises entail the conclusion. And I didn't really hear in any of this even really an attempt to actually give an argument, right? So what Jake needs to do to meet his burden of proof, right, the affirmative side, is to say, here are the other synthetic a priori propositions that are widely accepted or you should accept for whatever reason. Here's how they entail the eunomian premise. So we need to see that. Or if we're not going to get a logical derivation, right, we need to hear why is this proposition just kind of independently plausible? What puzzle does it solve that can't be solved by some other metaphysical system or whatnot? And I can let me just maybe sum that up by saying those are the only options, right? So either a proposition is justified on the basis of experience, it's a posteriori, or it's not, so it's a priori. If it's a priori, either it's a logical truth, which this isn't, or it's not, right? If it's not a logical truth, then either it's analytic, which this one isn't, or it's synthetic. And since we're talking about a priori propositions, it's synthetic a priori. So we really do need to see that it follows logically from some other synthetic a priori propositions, or there's something that it's doing that's giving us some warrant. But besides the fact that we don't, as far as I can see, have an argument for it, there are reasons for thinking that, at least suspecting that it's probably false.
Okay, so as you can see there, and this is after my opening statement, he's commenting basically saying that as far as he can tell, he doesn't see an actual argument that I presented. I hope it's clear to the audience now that I actually did present 3 arguments, and it was precisely that, to show that if his position is true, this is what it entails. It can possibly conflict with other metaphysical principles we hold to, and it leads to absurdities such as the possibility of an infinite number of divine persons, an arbitrary number of divine persons, the fact that way he defined nature, that the Father and Son, because they don't have the same causal powers, would not have the same divine nature. And the third argument, which he agrees was actually a good argument, and that's why he changed his position from the last time that he did a presentation on this, even though he seemed to be acting as if he didn't understand why I was bringing up the third argument. So I think I clearly did bring up arguments in refutation of that. But Abdulrahman, do you want to comment on that issue?
Yeah. So he again, he's appealing to theists, right? When he said time and time again in the discussion, or maybe once or twice, that, you know what, forget about me, forget about my worldview. It can be incoherent. You tell me why I should accept this stuff, and he's telling you, like, you know, there isn't an a priori synthetic principle that theists collectively agree on. So, well, if they did, right? Well, I mean, would that make it true? I mean, because obviously you're not looking for like an absolute consensus, because there isn't even a consensus on your position that it is possible, even among Christians, of course, it is possible for there to be a non-Aseity divine being. Well, then there isn't even a consensus on PSRs among theists, by the way. I mean, there are theists who completely reject it. There isn't a consensus on you know, the fact that I don't know if he thinks that the world is like is finite in the past, if it's been temporally caused. But if he does, I mean, there isn't an agreement on that. Some theists think it's eternal in that sense. And well, if that was the case, there would be a mere kind of like atemporal causal dependence between the world and God, and that would be exactly the same way the second divine person would relate to God. Or maybe there's some kind of spooky, mysterious, metaphysical distinction between the two types of dependency relations. But then the idea is, all of these things are not things that all theists agree on, right? And by the way, it is very common for theists, Christians and Muslims, to believe that God is necessarily Aseity. As in, necessarily Aseity. I know this can be understood because he can say that, well, God is, in the sense that the Father is. No, what I mean is, a lot of theists agree that for a divine being to be dependent on his existence on another entity, and I'm not talking about properties because I know people like making that move, right? On another entity, right? a lot of theists share the intuition, share the principle that that's not a god. That's a needy being who is in need of another being for his existence. Well, a lot of people a priori believe that to be impossible about God, and that's even related to some forms of ontological arguments. So I don't get this thing about, like, where's the principle that people agree on or something, and where is the argument? And he wants a premise conclusion, as if that's like how arguments need to be presented. I mean, it's not always how arguments need to be presented. He can have a back and forth with you on certain principles and their implications without giving you a strict, logical formulation of the argument. So I was surprised by that approach.
Yeah. And then, so after that, I gave my rebuttal, which, to be quite honest with you, I didn't really have much to rebut, because most of his opening statement, he spent time either talking about, like you said, a metaphysics class, and not really presenting much positive argument for his case, a historical analysis, which was fine, and then actually rebutting or attempting to rebut and respond to some of the things that I said. So I didn't really have much to go off of in terms of refuting anything he said. I don't think that I really need to play any clips from that. I pretty much just stated that. I explained, here are the arguments. I reiterated my 3 arguments and explained them again. I talked about the issue of the intrinsic, extrinsic property thing and why I was bringing up the 3rd argument. And I just gave a recap and re-explanation of my 3 main arguments. So we can go, I think, to Beau's first rebuttal, to when I think people can listen to what he says out the gate here. This is in his first attempted rebuttal after my first rebuttal. Okay, here we go.
Various arguments about the inconsistency of Beau Branson's worldview. Say we're not. I would say, though, still, I would say we're not literally getting an argument for the eunomian premise. What we're getting is various arguments about the inconsistency of Beau Branson's worldview. I'm perfectly happy, for the purposes of this debate, to just say that my worldview is incoherent. And so now that we've established that, we can go back to sort of the main subject of the debate, which is it really impossible to have the divine nature but lack aseity? And I'm still not sure why that would be. So I'll go through the argument.
Okay, so if you listen to what he says, well, he still doesn't see what the actual arguments are. The only thing he sees is, well, Beau Branson's particular worldview is incoherent. No, it's not that just I was simply arguing that Beau Branson's worldview was incoherent. I clearly presented arguments to show anyone who holds this view, these are the entailments. For example, the first argument, you're either going to have one person, which they reject, an infinite amount of persons, which is impossible, which Beau accepts is impossible, or an arbitrary number of divine persons, which I explained that would have to be Beau's position, and I explained the problems with his. That doesn't mean that taking this position only is a problem for Beau. No, it means here are the 2 options, infinite or arbitrary number. Both are a problem. And I focus on the arbitrary number and the difficulties with Beau trying to solve that issue. So it wasn't just, these are not just things that are only specific to Beau Branson, right? So that was just a mixed characterization of what I'm doing there. But anyway, I don't know if you want to comment on any of that, Abdulrahman. And him basically admitting, well, yeah, for the sake of this debate, I can just say my position is incoherent. I mean, why would you want to admit that your position is incoherent? No, you have to deal with what my arguments are.
Yeah, and this relates to what he said later. I don't know if you're going to get to that about the burden of proof, because I mean, he thinks it's just the debate is about like you simply trying to make your case while he can just sit back and knock your points out. But that's really not how it is, and that's kind of like the attitude he's giving right now. And I have a lot of respect for him, by the way. Like prior to the debate, I was really looking forward to it because I thought that it would be a great discussion. But then I was disappointed. But the idea is, you see, he knows the audience doesn't, right? And that's the issue. He knows that the implications of a non-ase divine being, according to him, according to his argument, means that the this non-ase divine being, or this ab alio, or dependent divine being, is necessary, right? He knows that that's where the argument is going. Now, the one thing he says about this, I think, later that is relevant is that, well, I think about this whole burden of proof thing, I think it's just closer to assume the possibility of a being that isn't shown to be explicitly contradictory in their existence, right? And that's not true, of course. That's not true. It depends. If you're again, it depends on what type of possibility you're talking about. If you're talking epistemic, irrelevant, if you're talking about mere logical, well, Jake's entire case here, which is not being addressed, is that the logical modality here is not, strictly speaking, relevant. And well, once you bring it into metaphysical modality, and you want to argue that it's metaphysically possible, then you need to do more than that. Because if that wasn't the case, then, well, the ontological argument would have been much simpler in terms of like the back and forth and, the symmetry breakers. Because, I mean, Dr. Bro definitely knows that the whole conversation that's had after the phase one of an ontological argument and the symmetry breakers is really the bigger chunk of the discussions between atheists and theists on ontological arguments. Now, the theist isn't just going to sit back and it's not like the atheist. So the atheist obviously can present an argument where he shows an incoherence in the concept, but that's not all they do. They can argue that there is a possible world where God doesn't exist, and then here you need a symmetry breaker, and the theists don't respond by, well, hey, I mean, you didn't show why God is impossible, and that's it, game over. No, they provide arguments for why. Let's say I think Proust presents arguments from experience. There are many other arguments. The limitation of the scope of the arguments you can make, that's another discussion. But then they don't just say, well, hey, you haven't shown a contradiction, game over. And that's basically what Dr. Bo is doing here, because he's relying on the assumption that it's just it's a premise for premise parity argument, when that's not really the case because of the metaphysical baggage that some of the other the second argument comes with. Like, for example, the causality premise. I mean, right now we're talking about an ab alio divine being. So, well, what does that mean? It means dependency, right? Well, wait, what kind of dependency? Are we going to be specific? Is it any kind of dependency? So clearly some kind of like temporal causality, that's not possible, right? Well, because then there would be a time where they didn't exist. Well, then what kind of dependency are you talking about, right? And clearly that's a very important question, because you can't say just any type of dependency, because of the implications that you reject of like the infinite number of persons, and because of other things. Of course, this is all coming with the assumption that we can't say that an extrinsic property is great making, not in the sense that you must have it to be great, but in the sense that were you to be put in a certain counterfactual situation, you would have a specific extrinsic property and not another, based on the fact that it's great making or not. And I think the intuition that most theists generally share, especially the common man, right, is that, well, yeah, necessarily speaking, God doesn't depend on others for his existence. I mean, that's the common intuition. So there's so much metaphysical baggage with that second argument, and he's the way he's approaching this here is as if, oh, you haven't shown a P and not P, right? I think I win, and it is possible for a dependent God to exist. I think that's very weak and disappointing.
Yeah. So let's continue and look at him trying to respond to my three arguments. So let's look at his response to my first argument here.
Powers or lack causal powers for reasons that don't have to do with the nature. So just to take a simple example, a copper wire can conduct electricity by nature. A copper key can conduct electricity by nature. But because the key has this shape, which is not part of the nature, but it has a certain shape, so it can unlock doors. So the key has a power that the wire doesn't, but that doesn't mean they have different natures. In Aristotelian terms, they have the same nature, which is copper. Also, I guess I'll address quickly the father cow.
So that was his response to my first argument. Really was limited to him talking about the distinction between a copper wire and a copper key, and a copper key having the ability to open a door, and a copper wire not having the ability to open up a door, but yet they still have the same nature. What did you think about that response, Abdulrahman?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying earlier about so here, this is where, well, he's taking the charge seriously, right? Because, well, if it is intrinsic, which it is, and part of the divine nature, then, well, you're going to end up with an infinite number of divine beings. So where does he need to put that causal capacity? He needs to put it in the accidental intrinsic properties of the Father, according to him. So, but why, right? I mean, just why? So why, why no causal power, or why no kind of power that can bring about a divine being that can't exist on his own and needs another to bring him into existence? I mean, so right now the response is, oh, well, it can be extrinsic. Well, wait, why? Sorry, it can be accidental. Okay, but why is it accidental? I mean, so you need to make that case to establish the possibility. It's not as if you can just say back and say it could be. Well, it could not be as well. I mean, it could be intrinsic to the nature. So where do we go from there? And in fact, based on the way he defines his Aristotelian understanding of natures, and what he said, I think in the past, that kind of indicates that there's sort of like empirical basis for like looking at causal powers and through that identifying their natures. That's very significant, especially considering the example he gave was of an artifact, right? Now I don't know if that's extremely relevant, but according to the Aristotelian position, I mean, artifacts don't have natures, right? So I don't know if that's relevant, but I think it is, because then you're gonna either way end up with that situation in the case of artifacts. But anyway, in the case of God here, now why are we choosing one over the other? Intrinsic accidental versus intrinsic to the nature and essential to the nature. It doesn't seem like he thinks he needs to make an argument for that. He's saying, well, it's possible. I don't think he realizes, I mean, maybe he does, but just there he didn't, that he needs to make this case in order to get anywhere in this debate, like just make one argument, right? But again, that's his theological commitment that he sees as necessary in order to make way for the metaphysical possibility of this dependent God, right? So the idea is that he really thinks he doesn't have a burden of proof in this discussion, which is a bit strange.
Yeah, bro. Exactly. And like you said, he said in his own presentation that artifacts don't have natures, and it seems to me that a copper key is an artifact, so it wouldn't have a nature. And so I don't see the relevance. Maybe he just chose the wrong example. Maybe I have a misunderstanding of that. Fine. Maybe I'll speak to Bo. I'm going to send him the link to this, and so he can review it, and maybe we can talk about it ourselves, or maybe he's going to do a video. I don't know. But anyway, so that's the most we really got out of his response, as far as I could tell, to my first argument. Now he goes into a response to the second argument, which is the father cow objection. So let's have a listen to that.
Objection. So I think that relies on different definitions of aseity, and maybe I can get into this more later if I can share my screen on another rebuttal or something. But so one way that we might define aseity, let's call it individual aseity, would just be to say a thing is individually ase if it just actually doesn't have a cause, and it's individually ab alio if it actually is caused by something else. So that's pretty simple, right? Natural aseity, we could call it. Well, let's talk about being naturally ab alio. That would be to say that you have a nature, so you are a kind of thing such that any member of that kind or anything with that nature is required to have a cause. So you believe in the principle of sufficient reason, like most Muslims and Christians do. Contingent beings by nature require to have a cause. I wish I had could put this on the screen, but in logical terms, if you negate that claim that something has a nature such that that nature requires it to have a cause, you get what's called a scope ambiguity, right? So the negation, the not, basically can be taken to modify two different places in a logical formula. So just the logical negation of saying that something has a nature that requires it to have a cause would be to say that it just doesn't have a nature that requires it to have a cause. That means it could have a cause or it could not have a cause, right? Just like a carnivore is something that must eat meat, right? If you're not a carnivore, you're a non-carnivore, that might mean just you're not required to eat meat, but you could. So you're an omnivore. You could do it if you want or not. You've got options, right? Or it might be that there's this thing called a non-carnivore that just can't eat meat. It's required to not eat meat, right? That would be a narrow scope interpretation. Again, the logical negation of saying that God, is ab alio by nature is just to say that it's not the case that he's ab alio by nature. So his nature doesn't require him to have a cause, doesn't require him to not have a cause. The contingency of the Father argument,
Okay, so that was his response to the second argument, which was the father cow argument, which was me basically saying that since under his view the divine nature doesn't seem to entail aseity, then we could have the possibility of an ase cow and what's the relevant difference and all that kind of stuff. And so that was his response. What did you think of what he had to say there, Abdulrahman?
Yeah. So here he's saying that so again with the PSR, right? That the assumption that we don't need to go back there, and that well, we agree already, so just leave it there. And well, again, why, right? But then the idea is, so you believe that all contingent things have an explanation, but why? So he agrees that the nature can entail this extrinsic property. That's okay. But then the reason Jake is questioning why is because then maybe it could shed some light on the other side when we're talking about necessary beings, right? Or more specifically, the divine nature. He actually took it to necessary beings much more broadly, which was kind of irrelevant. But the idea is that, well, is there something about the divine nature that entails aseity? Well, is there something about a contingent nature that entails it being caused or it needing to be caused? It doesn't seem like so. It seems like he doesn't want to go back to that point because it's just very difficult, based on his assessment of your argument, to make a case for why all contingent things need a cause. Because again, the atheist can play the exact same game, and I'd love to see that debate play out. Dr. Branson and an atheist is like, well, I don't see anything about the nature entailing that it requires a cause. And it's literally game over. I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, it's just, yeah, you could end with a brute fact. So what's the problem? I mean, where's the issue? Where's the A and not A? Where's the contradiction, right? Why are brute facts bad? Whatever reasons you're going to give, well, okay, it doesn't like result in a contradiction, or it doesn't entail that the atheist's position, like someone like Graham Moppy, is like incoherent. There's no contradiction about his position. Well, what are you going to do about that, right? So why does a contingent being require a cause? Well, if you can't prove it to me, then, well, hey, the ase being is a cow. No, or the necessary being, whatever you want to call it, is a cow. Show me a contradiction if you want to refute that. If that's how we're going to play the game, then I just don't see how you can play out any discussion or any debate with an atheist. I mean, good luck. But so that was kind of the point. Let's go back to those metaphysical commitments and see what you can do with this approach that you're taking to the debate. And it doesn't seem you can get very far.
Yeah, exactly. So let's see what his response now was to my third argument. Okay, here we go.
I agree with most of what Jake is saying. I think it's just a problem with the definition. It sounds to me like Jake would actually agree with me that that's just a glitch with the particular definition that Lewis and Langton give of extrinsic and intrinsic. That if you define an extrinsic property as one such that in any possible world where you have that property, then there has to be something else that exists, or vice versa. If you have that property, nothing else can exist, or if you lack it, you get an entailment. So if you define extrinsic properties as ones where having or lacking them either requires or prevents there from being other beings in any possible world, then sure, you get this problem that if you believe there are any necessarily existent beings, then you just kind of get this collapse where all properties turn out to be extrinsic. There are no intrinsic properties. But that just seems like that's an obvious problem with the definition, right? So there are lots of other ways to define intrinsic and extrinsic properties. Some people just take the distinction to be basic because we all kind of make this distinction at some point. Sometimes people take that to be basic and they define what a duplicate would be in terms of intrinsic properties. But some people just think, well, maybe I understand what a duplicate would be, and I just define intrinsic properties in those terms. So if you remember the old Star Trek series where people would go into the transporter beam and it would kind of break them down and beam them somewhere, but every now and then, the beam might hit a electromagnetic field or something and accidentally, creates two people that are exact duplicates of each other. Well, if you understand that, if you could watch Star Trek episodes and you understand, okay, Captain Riker accidentally got split into, two Rikers, then you know what an intrinsic property is, right? Another way, there's a million ways to do this, but a very simple way to do it is just to say, instead of talking about possible worlds, I just say that it's analytic, right? So extrinsic properties are ones where either it's analytic, in other words, true by definition, that if you have that property, something else exists, or if you lack that property, something else exists, or if you have it, nothing else exists, or if you lack it, nothing else exists. So for example, it's just true by definition that if you are a slave, you have a master, right? That's an extrinsic property. It's true by definition that if you are a parent, then you have a child, right? It's true by definition that if you are caused by something else, then there's something else, right, that caused you. So I think, it's just a matter of sort of tweaking that definition. Some other.
Okay, so notice that what my third argument, he actually says, well, I actually agree with Jake is saying, but then here are other options that we could take. But he doesn't acknowledge as to why I'm actually bringing that up. And we'll see in his second rebuttal on this same point, he emphasizes it and just acts as if he doesn't even understand why I'm bringing this third point up. But we'll leave that till when I play that section. He just recaps, and then basically I go into my second rebuttal. Now, in my second rebuttal, I mentioned to Bo, I reiterate why I gave this third argument, and that yes, Bo is not using this criteria in this debate clearly, but he did previously use it. And I asked him explicitly during that section, does he now reject the criteria, because previously he held to it? So I put that question to him. I re-emphasized to him that, look, this is a debate over metaphysics. Here are all the controversies involved, and this is what we need to discuss. You can't just have this discussion in a vacuum. And I just kept emphasizing that point, and then I was restating my arguments. I don't want to give too much time because I'm obviously spending a lot of time on here talking, so I don't want to play too much of myself in the video. I want to give Bo's side of the story as well. So that was my second rebuttal, and then Bo goes into his second rebuttal. And so again, he starts it off in a similar way as he did the last one. And let's take a listen to see what he said there.
So if you're ready, Bo, we'll say ready, set, go.
Okay. So about the burden of proof, as I understand it, that's how formal debates typically work. The person in the affirmative has the burden of proof. I'll be going first next time and have the affirmative position, so I'll have the burden of proof in the next argument. But also, I guess I want to say this. So there might be, I'm sure there's a lot of Muslims that are tuning in and Christians that are tuning in who, probably maybe already have their minds made up before they watch the debate. But there might be people tuning in who are sort of on the fence and they're thinking, I don't know. Is that possible? Is it not possible? And I doubt very seriously that any of them particularly care about Bo Branson in particular and whether his, other views are coherent or not. The topic of the debate is not, yay or nay, Bo Branson's overall worldview is coherent. It's supposed to be yay or nay, it's possible to have the divine nature without aseity. So I guess I don't really see. I'm not following why it would be germane. What my other broader commitments might be. So
again, he makes it seem as if I'm just saying, oh, Bo has these broader commitments. Well, dude, you're bringing up my supposed broader commitments in the debate and explaining why it's relevant. I'm not only just merely bringing up your broader commitments, I'm saying anybody who holds this view, these are going to be the entailments. Here are the different options. All of them result in a different problem, and therefore they should be rejected. And the position of one divine person who has to be Aseity is the better position to take. But he's making it seem like, it's just about Bo Brandt. It's not just about you, Bo. I'm being very specific, and I'm explaining the entailments of somebody holds to this view of answering the question that you are. These are the positions that it results in. The other ones you reject and agree with are problematic, and then I focus on yours and explain why you can't solve anything. But I don't know. It's just very disappointing that he kept restating it like this. What did you think about
it is. I just wanted to ask, what was the next debate supposed to be titled? What was supposed to be called? What was supposed to be about?
It's supposed to be, I mean, it's really directly related to this as to whether or not the Son is necessary. Because what he's trying to do here, he's trying to say, it basically, can you have the divine nature without Aseity? Which basically means, is the Son possible? And so he's just trying to prove that the Son is possible to set up for his ontological argument in the next one to say, well, I proved that he's possible, and now we need to talk about whether or not the Son is necessary. And then he's going to put that argument and say, well, if he's possibly necessary, then he's necessary. That's the thing.
Just curious, right? Just before I comment, what do you think he would say? Because I mean, if that's the way it goes, I mean, the debate would be very easy. You could just sit back and say, well, assuming you established the possibility, right? Let's say the Son is contingent, like in the sense that necessity is an accidental intrinsic property that's exclusive to the Father, and the Son existing in some possible world or it being possible just doesn't mean that he's necessary, because, well, there's nothing about the nature itself that's necessary, but it's a hypostatic property of the Father. So how do you think he'd approach that?
Well, no, remember, I think he's going to say that the nature is, I think he wants to say that the nature is necessary, but just that.
But you could just deny that. You could just say it's a hypostatic property of the Father. I mean, it's like exclusive to the Father's, the person of the Father. I mean, it's just because this kind of, because he can do that with the causal powers, right? I mean, you could do that with necessity. I mean, we could just do this all day. But then anyway, so again, he's approaching it like there's no burden of proof. But sorry, remind me exactly what because I recall the burden of proof part that he was talking about. What was he generally saying? If you just say something, it's gonna come right back.
He was basically saying that, look, there are people who are on the fence who are watching this, and
So the idea is, first of all, I mean, obviously, as you just said, I mean, he's relying on certain things in your background and certain shared commitments. I mean, when he says that, well, no, Unitarian is going to want to say that, no, theist is going to want to say that. Give me a principle that, well, theists hold to. Otherwise, it's, I mean, you're doing that yourself. And this idea of, like, you can't use the person's commitment to show them that if they accept a certain position, they fall into an absurdity, right? To show them that, well, it isn't possible. I mean, reductio ad absurdum. I mean, isn't that what they are, in the sense that, well, is it that every time you try to argue from absurdity, you have to, I mean, how are you going to do it? You need to do it in a vacuum, or does the absurdity, or can the absurdity be based on the commitments of your interlocutor? I mean, it's just a very strange way of approaching debates. If you have to literally come in a vacuum, as if you're talking to a robot, like, I'm just going to assess what you're saying in a vacuum. Forget about my background. I mean, that's just not how it works. If I'm going to show you there's an absurdity, there's always going to be prior commitments. I mean, no matter how narrow you want the prior commitments to be, there's going to be something there. I mean, at least you have to accept that contradictions are impossible. I mean, what if you don't? What if you're talking to a grain priest or something, right? So the idea is this approach that, you just prove it to me in a vacuum and forget about me. And he's being sarcastic about it, as if, look, okay, well, I'm incoherent, man. Just focus on the topic, as if you're not focusing on the topic. When his very presentation kind of like implicitly relies on the shared ground you two have and your specific background. It's just really strange how that, and disappointing, because that just made the discussion not really fruitful, in the sense that it's just somebody sitting back and saying, show me a contradiction, and you always wiggle your way out of a contradiction. It's the easiest thing to do. It's the easiest thing to do, really. If that was a debate, I mean, if in order to win a debate, I simply had to wiggle out of a contradiction without consideration of my prior commitments, you can win every debate you get involved in.
Yeah, so let's listen further to what he says now here.
Kind of along those lines. So I mean, you talk a lot about other presentations I've given and this sort of thing, and it's kind of all interesting autobiography, but it doesn't seem relevant to the point at hand. So I would encourage you.
So he's mentioning the other presentation, which I mentioned, which I played for you guys. And he says, well, that's an interesting autobiography, but it's not really relevant to the point at hand. Of course it is, because I went into the debate assuming that that was your position, where you argued on the basis of the criteria from Lewis and Langston about what an intrinsic property is. And I was showing the entailments of that view, that it results in God not being a necessary being, or there being some kind of other problem, an explosion, that only properties are going to all turn out to be extrinsic, or that you have these contingent beings that don't have an explanation of God, or that you have multiple necessary and this explosion of necessary beings, because everything then is going to turn out to be Aseity and exist in all these possible worlds. And I'm bringing this up, and he the thing, Bo, if you watch this later, this is really what bothered me the most in this discussion on this third argument. Why didn't you just say, Jake, yes, it would have been relevant if I still held that view. I know the last time I addressed you publicly, I did hold that view, and I can see why you brought this argument up. But now I agree with your criticisms, and because of them, I now reject that categorization, and I won't use it in my argumentation for my position. Why not say that? But instead, it was this hand waving, like acting as if, why am I giving this? And almost, oh, this is an interesting biography, but it's not relevant to the point at hand. That was not really a fair point, Bob. Honestly, that was really not a fair way that you stated this and addressed this argument. You should have been more forthright and honest about the context of this discussion, and just stated that you've changed your mind, which is fine. But you've changed your mind due to criticisms, which is now going to be the second time that you do it. So, look, each time that you keep presenting your view, I'm responding to it, and you keep having to modify your position, which is fine. But it's at least showing that my criticisms are being targeted appropriately, and you're having to change your position in light of my criticisms to your view, which you yourself even admitted in that previous video. And now you're doing it again. You're changing your view this time, but last time you were very clear and open about it. And this time you've changed your view without explicitly stating it, and then acting as if you don't understand why I'm bringing up this point in this debate. That was really unfortunate, but let's continue to listen a little bit here.
If I can say so, to think about people who are just sort of neutral listeners who are maybe on the fence, and they're trying to think about this issue for themselves and think, do I want to believe that it's possible to have the divine nature without Aseity? And likely those people don't really care about whether Bo Branson's worldview is coherent. And I'm not sure I care much about Bo Branson's worldview either too much. But as far as the
Again, he acts like that was a worldview question. That's not a worldview question. That was directly related to the debate. That was very strange.
Yeah, this argument about the contingency of the Father. So I'll try to be more clear. Yes, I reject that Langton-Lewis account of the extrinsic-intrinsic property distinction.
Okay, notice what he said. Yes, I do reject the Langston-Lewis account of intrinsic-extrinsic distinction. I have to remind you guys that he was using that criteria. Let me just show the screen one more time. And the last time, which he addressed me several times in this video after the first debate that we had. Okay, right here. The Langston-Lewis criteria that he said he just rejects now in this debate, and he didn't understand why I brought it up. Well, it's right here. This is the criteria he's using and arguing on Orthodox Shahada channel. Does God have to have a son? This wasn't like 10 years ago, guys. This was July of last year. He never changed his view publicly or said anything else privately. So he shouldn't be surprised as why I'm bringing up this objection. Now he's saying he rejects it. He rejects it in light of criticisms that have been raised now to show that he had to modify his own argument and position again. Okay. So anyway, I don't know if you want to comment on that, Abdulrahman. Okay, let me share my screen and go back to this initial debate here.
You know, if I had to settle on an account, I would say it's analytic instead of an issue about just metaphysical necessity. And I don't see that still runs into the same problems.
Okay, so now he's saying, yeah, he's changing his view to it just being analytic rather than the Langston-Lewis type of account here. Anyway, we can move on to another point that, okay, where he basically reiterates the same point again, just about 2 minutes later.
So suppose that Aseity is an intrinsic property. It doesn't follow just because something's an intrinsic property that it's part of a nature, right? So the shape of a key is intrinsic. Shapes are universally, kind of paradigm examples of intrinsic properties, but things don't have a shape by nature. So even if suppose Aseity is an intrinsic property, it doesn't seem to follow that it's part of the nature, or that having a divine nature would require Aseity. I think that's maybe all the notes that I took down. I note that I'll just note my confusion as to what's meant by talk about patchwork, something, copy and pasting something. I'm not sure what that argument amounted to, but I'm still not. I guess I'm just still not seeing. So I guess the idea is if we negate the eunomian premise, then we're supposed to get various absurd consequences. But it seems like those absurd consequences only come in the context of various auxiliary premises. And it would be one thing if those auxiliary premises were something like, again, like the principle of sufficient reason. Most theists accept the principle of sufficient reason. It's part of why most people that are theists are theists. If it just conflicted with that, then that might worry me. But I'm just not saying. It seems like there's a lot of.
He's saying if it did conflict with the PSR, then it would worry you. But one of my potential objections raised was related to the PSR and the fact that you have this arbitrary number of divine persons without an explanation other than appealing to something that you by yourself have admitted is from the tradition is mysterious, but you can't actually explain and argue for it. So
something else. I mean, what he's saying about Aseity, right? So assuming that for the sake of argument, if it is intrinsic, well, it doesn't have to be essential to the nature. It could be accidental. Well, I mean, you could say that for every property. I mean, there's this worry with, this sort of like blurry, arbitrary standard for what we're going to regard as essential to the nature and not, because like whatever you say of the nature, we could say that, well, it's not specific to the nature. It could be exclusive to the Father, for example. And you do that with Aseity, assuming it's intrinsic, right? I don't think you want to do that, because I think you realize that it's quite counterintuitive to assume that something, if it were, I mean, assuming that that's required, but let's assume it is intrinsic. I think it's quite obvious that it would be great making, just as much as I think it would be great making to have the causal power, or the power, whatever you want to call it, necessary to bring about another divine being. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a greater power to have, really. And it seems like if you're going to have that power intrinsically, well, then it looks like that's what's going to qualify as a great making property. I mean, what else would? I mean, really, because in that sense, well, you could throw everything out into an accidental property, even if it's intrinsic, including omniscience. I mean, why not? Because so again, he's relying on this background that there are these specific properties we agree on, as if, I mean, using his standard, we could just move properties back and forth from the accidental segment to the nature segment as we wish. And honestly, I don't think sorry, I think one of the reasons he really does make this argument rely on the extrinsicality of Aseity is because it's quite obviously widespread and intuitive that, you know, the notion that it is great making not to depend on another. But fine, if it's just going to be intrinsic, if it's going to be intrinsic, maybe that's just one of the most obvious ones that needs to be part of the nature. So let's put it, you know, as something extrinsic, as if that can't be great making too, in a sort of like entailment fashion. It can be. I think it's just as intuitive. But then we could just do that with the power because it's intrinsic, and you agree it's intrinsic, but you're putting it only in the Father. Why? It's great making, so it needs to be part of the nature, essential to the nature. Well, therefore, if it's part of the nature, there's going to be an infinite number of beings, so it can't exist. It just seems like not really clear the criteria he's using.
Yep. Let's go here. Play like the last minute or so of his rebuttal.
To be taken out of this box, right? So if it's a cat, it eats meat. It doesn't follow that if it eats meat, then it has to be a cat, right? It could be a non-cat. Similarly, if I say something like if all contingent beings or all imperfect beings have to have a cause. Okay, so all contingent beings have to have a cause, but if it's a non-contingent being, that means it might have a cause or it might not, right? So think about if you're a carnivore, you have to eat meat. If you're just a non-carnivore, it doesn't mean you have to fail to eat meat. It just means you can do either one, right? You can eat meat, you cannot eat meat. And similarly, right, what the eunomian premise is saying is it's saying that if something is divine, it has to not have a cause. Well, everyone, I mean, all theists pretty much are going to agree that if something is creaturely, then it has to have a cause, right? But it doesn't follow from that if it's non-creaturely, it has to fail to have a cause, right? If it's a creature, it has to have a cause. If it's a non-creature, it could do either one, right? That's just how the logic of it works. So it's not like the eunomian premise just follows from the principle of sufficient reason. It doesn't seem to follow. I mean,
so what do you think about that one? Because I think that's key, where he's just saying, yeah, well, all theists are just obviously going to agree that, you know, all contingent beings have to have a cause, but it doesn't follow that from that, you know, something that's necessary is not going to have a cause. It could be necessary and have a cause or not, you know?
Yeah, and this is part of what you were trying to do when you were basically questioning, you know, those commitments. As in, like, so part of why you think a contingent thing has an explanation, right? It's a contingent thing exists in some worlds, not others. Well, why those worlds and not others? As in, its essence doesn't entail its existence, right? Yeah. So well, that
exactly.
looks like it needs an external explanation. Well, if it's necessary, like, you know, like necessary propositions, whether you're going to say analytic or not, well, it seems like, well, the world couldn't be any way where, you know, they'd be otherwise or they wouldn't exist, and that just seems to just mirror the same intuition that, well, it's necessary, so it doesn't require an explanation. Now you're saying it's necessary and it requires an explanation. It's not exactly 100% analogous to like those other analytic propositions on like 1 + 1 = 2, but then there does seem to be at least the effort or the belief that there is an ontological account for the necessity of this being, and we're acting here like there's no. It's just, you know, okay, we'll accept the principle of sufficient reason. Every contingent being has an explanation, and just, you know, close that door. Just forget about it. Forget why the intuition's involved with that, or, you know, however, even if it's an a priori reason, it doesn't mean it can't have like rationalization. So whatever rationalizations can be involved with it, let's just put that aside and not go back there, because we both agree on it. But it's not about worldviews, right? So why should we put it aside? And it just looks like the same intuition applies with necessary things, right? Now, obviously, so later he brings up properties, and somebody might say it right now in the chat, you know, but hey, necessary properties. And so clearly, I mean, that's just obviously not analogous. We're talking about necessary beings, existence, as in existence that are described by properties, not properties that require, by definition, you know, something that they attach to in order to be a property of. So it just looks like it's inconsistency, you know, with all due respect, in terms of how he's just, you know, making that worldview objection, and then at the same time just relying on your worldview to sit back and effortlessly try to make his case.
Yep. Okay. So let me continue playing here.
You know, it maybe follows from accepting a certain analysis of extrinsic and intrinsic properties, but I've explained that I reject that analysis of follows. So it's not like the Eunomian premise just follows from the principle of sufficient reason. It doesn't seem to follow. I mean, it maybe follows from accepting a certain analysis of extrinsic and intrinsic properties, but I've explained that I reject that.
Wow, so this to me was actually a key point, because he again says, well, it doesn't seem like the Eunomian premise follows from this other thing that was me mentioned, the PSR, but the Eunomian premise may follow from a certain analysis of intrinsic and extrinsic properties, but I reject that analysis, which is the one he's referring to, which is the Lewis-Langston categorization, which he embraced and publicly defended on that video just last year. So he's admitting that if he still held that position, and even at the time of last year, that would necessarily contradict his position, and the Eunomian premise would be true. Therefore, my third argument was not irrelevant. It was deeply relevant to the topic. And he knows that it was so relevant and so problematic for his previous view that he had an internal contradiction within his position that I don't know. I just don't understand why he couldn't just openly admit that, Bo. You should have been more open and forthright and say, yeah, this was a devastating critique, and now this is why I've changed my critique, even though you haven't announced it. But it seemed as if he didn't want to publicly say that he changed his position. You clearly did. Because, I mean, that's conceding that the third argument literally would completely destroy his position, and the Eunomian premise would be established on that analysis of intrinsic properties. Okay, let me continue here. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll say something that I just remembered. It's not related to this point, but something, and it reminded me of it when earlier he's saying something like, people have been trying for I don't know how many, for ages to make the Eunomian premise work, but it's just been failure after failure after failure. And I mean, this it's a bit strange. I mean, you can hold that view, obviously. So I can hold the view that people have been trying to make the problem of evil work, and they've just been trying and trying, and it's been failed. I can hold that view, right, based on actual substantive arguments. Well, like in a debate with somebody who's presenting the argument, or an atheist, it's just going to be irrelevant that, guys, it just hasn't worked. No, from his perspective, it worked, right? Now, clearly, based on the specific criteria that whether you're looking for, which is quite trivial. I mean, it's just a non-starter for the entire debate. It's just like the way you're looking at possibility and impossibility in this context here. Yeah, it might be the case that people haven't managed to give you that. But I just think that's highly irrelevant, specifically given the way Jake has approached the debate and made that clear from the very beginning. So the fact that, people have been trying, but they've failed. Well, first of all, they're going to disagree with you clearly, right? So, I mean, that obviously doesn't mean that you're wrong. You might be right that they failed, but then in a debate with somebody who's claiming that the premise is successful, or who's trying to argue against your position in any way, just bringing up that point is just kind of irrelevant, because that's actually the dispute, whether it works or not. So this inductive analysis only works if you do believe that the case hasn't been established or the argument doesn't work. So it's in that sense, from a neutral perspective, it's kind of subjective.
Yep. I agree. And one other thing, just to point out on what I was saying, what Bo just said means that he is saying that Dr. Joshua Sijuwade's position is necessarily false, because he holds to that criteria, and Bo is saying that if you hold to that criteria, it does cause a huge problem for your worldview, and specifically for this debate on the Eunomian premise, that he does believe that it's a refutation of the Eunomian premise. So indirectly, he's saying that Dr. Josh Sijuwade's position would be false, and it would be problematic, because you can't hold to that criteria and maintain the Eunomian premise. Anyway, let me just finish here, because this is like the end of his rebuttal.
Again, it doesn't seem to. I mean, there don't seem to be these absurd entailments unless you add a bunch of other metaphysics that I don't agree to. So maybe the Q&A can help clarify some of this stuff, and we'll see. So I'll go ahead and end.
Notice what he said. He said there's no problem unless you add these other metaphysics, right? well, there is on the reverse, there is problems for his position unless he adds all these metaphysics. Right? Like,
Exactly.
that's
He wants
the whole debate, dude.
Yeah, he's expecting that the case needs to be made in a vacuum, right? Without like, I mean, he's saying like auxiliary, premises and stuff like that. Well, how do we define what's in the background and what's going to be brought forward as an auxiliary hypothesis, but then or premise? But the whole idea is that in order for you to respond to some of Jake's objections and establish, as you should, your case, your positive case for the possibility, given the implications of the debate that you're aware of, you need to bring in these metaphysical considerations. I mean, the idea of dependency and the types of dependency and these and the mystery behind it and stuff like that. I mean, that's all that baggage is not there in that first ontological argument that Dr. Bo says we all accept, although it just depends on what form and what the details there are. But the idea is, even if that's true, even if that has to be accepted, even if this just broad conceivability is just going to establish the whole thing, oh, no contradiction, therefore possible, therefore necessary. If it was that easy, we could just keep copy pasting, dependent gods all the way until something is going to need to come in there and stop it, or just from the very start say that, well, the implications of this are absurd unless there's this additional consideration. So the simpler view, absent the theological considerations, is more serious. Well, therefore it is not possible. So your case fails. And then you're going to bring in this theological consideration. And then we can equally bring in a theological consideration. You say, well, there are these two types of mysterious dependencies. Well, then we say there are 0 types of mysterious dependencies that would render a God dependent. So I guess game over then in that sense, if by those standards.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so now we move into the cross-examination section, which is 10 minutes of me cross-examining him first, and then the second one is with him. I'm going to play my cross-examination, and we can see the interaction here.
So let me just start off with the father-cow argument, which is something that I was concerned with here. My question to you is, why is it that the divine nature produces an ase person rather than the nature of a cow or a rock or anything else?
I mean, I'm not claiming that it does. I'm just saying it's possible.
What do you mean? You believe that there's an ase divine person? Yeah. So I'm saying, why is it that the divine nature somehow has an ase person within it, but a cow or a rock does not?
That a cow or a rock can't be ase?
Yes. Do you think that they can be?
No, I mean, I would take it that a contingent being, I believe in the principle of sufficient reason, right? So a contingent being would have to have a cause.
But why is it contingent?
Why are cows contingent?
Yeah, or rocks or anything else.
So, I mean, they're physical objects. They're made up of physical parts, right? So you can take a cow and cut it up and cook it and eat it, right?
Yes.
Right.
So does that have anything to do with the nature of the cow?
Yeah.
Right. So this is my point. Is that right? So this is my point. Is that the nature of the rock and the cow have to do with why it is contingent and couldn't be ase.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then the reverse of that. Why? Right. But then exactly. But then that would mean the reverse should also be true. But you're saying it's not. That the divine nature doesn't necessarily entail aseity. So that's the disconnect that I'm seeing.
Right. So the fallacy that you're making is trying to infer the logical converse of a proposition, right? So again, from if P then Q, it doesn't follow that if Q then P, right? So let's take this square here, right? So let's say these are things that are dependent and contingent. These are things that are independent or they're necessary, right? Here's things that are uncaused and things that are caused. So the principle of sufficient reason gets rid of this box, right? It says you can't have a contingent being like a cow that doesn't have a cause, right? That's uncaused. So if it's contingent, it's got to go down here in this caused spot, right? The cosmological argument, for example, says, okay, well, you've got all these things that are caused, but they can't just be caused in a circle, and it can't go on infinitely, right? So we need to get out of this caused section to something up here that's uncaused, right? But
so anyway, at this point, you notice he's appealing to the contingency argument, and he's trying to appeal to the PSR and talking about contingent beings and their nature and the fact that they're caused. And that's my whole point. I'm trying to bring the fact that all of these things are relevant to the discussion. Now, he thinks I'm just automatically arguing in the reverse and saying that this has to be the case in a logical way. I'm just saying that it's relevant to the discussion, how we identify how something is contingent, how something is necessary. They're related to each other. It's not in a vacuum that you're just looking at contingent things that has no implications on anything related to necessary beings and things that are Aseity. But he goes into this paper thing. But anyway, Abdulrahman, do you want to comment on this part?
Yeah. So it's almost as if he's trying, as you're saying, it's almost as if he's trying to say that you're as if you think that, you know, if someone says that if P then Q, then that just implies like the logical converse. Clearly, that's not what you're saying. I mean, it might sound like that to just like if you just look at that one statement, but then given the context, clearly that's not what you mean. What you do mean is that, well, here you have this metaphysical principle where you're reasoning about the nature of the thing, and you're saying it must require a cause for these reasons. And basically, I'm wondering why you find it so strange and so awkward for anyone to say the same thing about the divine nature, a similar thing, as in an extrinsic property being entailed. And I mean, nobody's saying that. Well, you know, because clearly, if Dr. Bo wants to say, well, if something is Aseity, then it is a divine being, but not every divine being has to be Aseity. Well, that's. I mean, obviously, you could say that. Well, if something is ab alio, then it has to be contingent, but not every contingent being is ab alio. Well, now we both don't agree on that. But the question is why? Either way, whether it's for this principle or that. And the fact that, well, you know, providing an ontological account for the necessity of that divine nature. So again, as I was trying to explain it earlier, right? When you're thinking abstractly of contingent beings in this broad conceivability sense, right? And there's nothing about that nature you're thinking of that implies existence. So, you know, there must be a preponderance of existence over non-existence and all that stuff where there's a cause. And then while you're thinking there must be some ontological account of like this nature you're thinking of that necessarily must exist, and the world couldn't be in any way without it existing. It just looks like that just entails the opposite, that, well, this isn't the kind of thing that requires an external explanation, because you can think of necessary things that seem to explain their own existence, but you're like, no, it has this external mysterious, you know, causal relation, or it's just grounded in something or whatever. And you don't provide reasons for that, but the idea is just you have the intuition about that, you have the intuition about the necessary existence. Now he might want to say something like, well, the principle of sufficient reason is necessary, you know, to get you out of certain absurdities and stuff like that, and to explain the way we account for things. Well, equally, that conclusion we arrive at through the PSR is equally important. I mean, it's equally important as to why it's a stopping point. You can't just say, well, it qualifies as a stopping point because it exists in every possible world, but its kind can still have a cause. I mean, where are you getting that from, right? So the idea is just as you have an intuition over here, we have an intuition over there, and basically providing an ontological account for that, for the necessity of a divine being is a huge part of what people do in natural theology. Even people like Proust say that, you know, there must be an ontological account for his necessity, even if we are unable to provide one. And so there's the intuition is on both sides, and Jake's entire point is that you can't just be wish-washy about it and hand wave and say that, no, we accept this one, but that one can't even be looked at unless you give me some kind of contradiction. All kinds of atheists can give you all kinds of alternatives to your PSR that doesn't result in a contradiction, right? By your standards of a contradiction, because we should put the background aside, or that doesn't result in some kind of inconsistency. It might result in them like being implausible. So maybe like it's implausible for one specific state that is seemingly contingent to be Aseity or uncaused or necessary, as opposed to everything else that's of the same kind, which I think kind of also applies to your position. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. So there's no logical problem there in the sense that they are not being incoherent unless they're contradicting some of their prior commitments which needs to be established sometimes in order to convince other people.
Yeah. So then, I mean, I don't want to play the whole cross-examination section, but just so people can understand a little bit of the back and forth, they should obviously watch the whole debate themselves and make up their own minds. But here was another section from me cross-examining him.
Always existed, and I think you'd agree that you haven't always existed, right? So if you haven't always existed, then it's possible for you to not exist.
So I was caused.
Right.
Okay. So if
right. Cause, yeah.
No, it's the opposite. You're moving from the fact that I'm caused to I'm contingent. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Because I'm asking you, how are you identifying what is contingent?
No. Yeah, that's not what I would do. I would move from the fact that you actually have failed to exist, right? And actuality entails possibility. So the fact that you have actually at one time failed to exist means it's possible for you to not exist. So that's why I would conclude that.
Yeah, but the way that you know that is by the nature of what I am and the fact that I'm caused.
No, I'm just a dumb person who thinks that you haven't always existed. I mean, I could be wrong. You could correct me.
So you're just taking it as a brute fact.
I guess I feel pretty comfortable in the assumption that you haven't always existed.
Yeah, but the question is why.
Open to correction, but
the question is why, because I'm trying to get at your intuitions. And the fact of the matter is, when you use a contingency argument, you have to explain how you're identifying what contingents are. And it's going to be whether it be having to do with it being caused, or if you believe in divine simplicity, which you don't, and the fact that it's made up of parts and it's caused by those parts, or if you say that it has arbitrary limits. There are a number of different ways that you can do it. But one of the ways that you're identifying the fact that something is contingent is the fact that it's caused. Has a cause. It's not uncaused.
Certainly if I had independent reasons to think something was caused, then I would think that it was caused. But it seems like I have good reasons to think that you are contingent. So I can imagine, I don't want to imagine it, but I can imagine you dying, or I can imagine someone, cutting you into parts or something like that. And then if all the atoms that made up your body just were spread out to the corners of the universe, I guess you would cease to exist. And that, again, maybe I'm just a simple man, but that seems like that would be possible to me. So.
Yeah. Anyway, so on the question I was asking about.
So there, I'm pressing on this causation thing, because really what his point seems to entail is that, obviously, just because you're caused doesn't mean you're a contingent being. And I'm trying to show doesn't really seem to be the intuition that we use when we take a look at how we identify contingent things in the universe. One of the ways we identify that things are contingent is by the fact that they're caused. And he says, well, no, I just kind of know that you're a contingent being because you haven't always existed. Well, how do you know that I haven't always existed? Because you can identify that I'm caused by the way that I am, right? By my nature. So it seems to lead into this problem, and I'm trying to show an apparent inconsistency, or at least from my own approach. One of the ways that I know that something is contingent is that it's caused, right? Or the fact that it has an explanation outside of itself. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Abdulrahman.
Yes. So there I think two things. So first of all, if because a part of what he's saying might be like, well, I see that you come into being, as in there was a time where you didn't exist and now you exist. Therefore, that's how I know that you're contingent, or that whatever it is, you require some kind of explanation. Well, what about the things that you didn't see? So it's not going to be strictly speaking inductive in that sense, because what is the criteria? If the criteria is that it came into being, well, it could be something that is not God, that didn't come into being and just always existed. So that doesn't seem like it's going to work. If you're talking about conceivability, so you can conceive of Jake not existing or going out of existence. Well, I can conceive of the sun not existing or going out of existence. In fact, I can conceive of, based on what he discussed in the cross-examination about, well, can you think of an omniscience without aseity? Can you think of this?
Yeah, which we're going to get to
that. Well, that looks like you could take it apart then. Conceptually, you could think of, well, God, I can conceive of him without omnipotence or something, or without goodness. By that notion of conceivability, where it's just like, certain concepts put together, and we just need to think of a world where, taking one of them out doesn't entail a contradiction. That's just gonna. Obviously, keeping in mind that we can just simply throw things out of the essential properties of nature like necessity and stuff. So given we don't have a clear criteria for that, then we could just do the same thing and say, well, God's contingent because he can exist in this world without that world without this. And I could really conceive of, in fact, I believe the Son or a non, I'll say, divine being doesn't exist. Well, that's is that good enough then? In the sense that have we established that he necessarily doesn't because I've conceived of that? So I don't know.
Yeah, no, we'll get to that point in just a minute here.
The causing and the Father causing the Son. You never really addressed my question about why there couldn't be an infinite amount of persons.
All right, this will be Bo's last answer.
Okay.
So yeah, if the property of generating a divine person is shareable, then there would be an infinite number of divine persons. But if it's not, then there wouldn't.
All right, and with that ends Jake's cross-examination of Bo, and now we'll have 10 minutes for.
So he's admitting there that if the property of causing another divine person is shareable, well then, yes, you would wind up in an infinite amount of divine persons. Well, I'm saying that property is shareable, right? I'm using that for the sake of argument. That property is shareable, and therefore you would wind up with an infinite amount of divine persons. How can he show that if that property exists in the Father, that it's impossible for it to be shareable? Other than him saying, oh, it leads to a contradiction. I'm saying, yeah, it leads to a contradiction. Therefore, to reject that from the start is what I'm doing. I'm saying, look, if you take this position, right, it doesn't seem anything, especially given the way that he defines nature, why I wouldn't see that property as intrinsic to the nature. Now, other than this ad hoc maneuver in which you're relegating it to a personal property of the Father rather than an intrinsic property of the nature, I have no reason to accept that. You're just doing it to try to avoid the conclusion of the contradiction. I'm saying, wait, you're good. I'm saying we need to stop a bit further because you're either going to have that contradiction or you're going to have an arbitrary number of divine persons, which is what his position eventually results in. So
yeah, and imagine like the power to create a divine being not being great making. I mean if anything is great making, it probably should be that. But I mean that last question, I wished it would have, the cross examination would have went on longer, because I mean, there you are, you're saying that, well, if it's shareable, then it would result in an infinite number of persons, so let's put it in.
And how would he show that it's impossible for it to be shareable? Because he would have to say that, because I'm saying it's possible for it to be shareable. Therefore, you would have this possibility of an infinite amount of divine persons.
Exactly.
He has to say it's impossible in that case.
Yeah, and then maybe he wants to say, well, then, hey, if we establish the fact that it's possible, as in, well, there's no contradiction with, like, all the essential attributes of a divine being plus being dependent, all these being compossible, means that, well, okay, therefore he's necessary. I mean, it has to be possible, so let's put this causal power, let's put this power in the hypostatic as like an intrinsic accidental property. And somebody was asking to explain what that is. It's basically a property that is intrinsic, as in it's not relational with something outside of you, but it's not essential for you to be the kind you are, so not for you to be a human. So what he mentioned about the key, for example, right? So the idea is you have to do all this work, right? You have to do all this work, and those are the questions being asked, as in, well, if you're going to establish the possibility, well, it's no longer that, relatively simpler ontological argument we're talking about. We're talking about so many metaphysical considerations and so many implications. And, what work you're going to have to do to limit that is really going to be dependent on how you see these things. And it's as if these questions are really that as clear as they seem in terms of, and Jake alluded to the idea of Aristotelian natures, but generally the concept of like what you're going to include in a nature and not. I mean, it's as if it's clear enough for that to be established. I mean, there it's possible. I mean, checkmate, Muslim. I don't think that's how it works.
Yeah. So now we'll move on to Bo's 10-minute cross-examination here. This is an important point to clarify because a lot of people didn't even understand what Bo was trying to do here.
So is there anything, as far as you can tell, about the definition of omniscience that would require a being to be Ase if it was omniscient?
Omniscience, and how are you defining it?
Notice how he's asking, is there anything about the definition of the term that requires? It's not about the metaphysics, it's about the definition of the term that requires a being that has it to be Ase, right? He's not asking about the metaphysics of the being, he's asking about the definition of the term.
So however you ordinarily think about omniscience with respect to God, so just knowing all truths or something like that?
I don't think so.
Okay. What about being omnibenevolent? So just, always having a morally perfect will or something like that?
No, I don't think omnibenevolent. I mean, going back to omniscience, the only thing I can think of is that if the effect can't really know the nature of the cause, then that would be a problem.
Okay.
Okay, so and he kind of, I give that slight comeback about the effect not being able to know the nature of the cause, and he's just like, oh, okay, and it seemed like he thought that may have been a relevant, good objection, and just moved on from the point, didn't really want to address it, which I thought was interesting.
Was it because I think I know what you're doing there. Is it because like for like the Orthodox view, right, God's nature is unknowable? Or is it that there's that qualification, so that's another metaphysical consideration in that sense, right?
No. I'm saying that because some people hold the metaphysical principle that an effect cannot know the nature of the cause or know the cause perfectly, right? And so if the effect cannot know its cause perfectly, especially when it comes to God, right, then it could be the case that if you're caused, you couldn't be omniscient because you couldn't know the cause perfectly, right? And that's would be something that you wouldn't be able to know.
I mean, we could just squeeze that principle in, and it's just game over. I mean,
yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah, I was just making a point to say, like, dude, I could argue this, and then you would have to say that this metaphysical principle, which I'm using, that an effect of a cause cannot know it perfectly, is necessarily false, and then you'd have to do all that work. I was just saying, well, it's possible, and so then it throws a spanner in the works. But anyway,
so maybe you'd say it's not true just from sort of the definition of omniscience, although there might be some metaphysical issue there, depending. What about this? So this is.
So notice what he's saying. He's saying he wants to keep it just definitionally, but then he's saying, oh, but there might be some kind of problem metaphysically. Dude, the whole debate is on the metaphysics. Of course, that's why I'm bringing up these points to say that depending on your metaphysics is whether or not you're going to think that this is true. This is not just something in a box, just by definition, everything. It doesn't work like that.
Sometimes, for example, St. Irenaeus and some other church fathers put it this way. They talk about the Son and the Holy Spirit as like the right and left hands of God. So meaning sort of they're like these causal intermediaries that God interacts with the world through. I know it's kind of I guess different people have different views about this, but in the Quran, it talks a little about God's hands or whatever. So some people I know take that very literally. Some people just take it to be, I guess, a metaphor for something like the way God causally interacts with things or attributes or something like that. How do you take that? Do you take it that God literally has physical hands, or do you take those to be kind of attributes, or do you have a different interpretation of it?
So at this point, he's moving on to another attribute. He starts off with, omniscience and then omnibenevolence. And now he's using wait, does God have literal physical hands, or are they just like attributes or metaphor or what? And it's like, dude, we don't believe that God's hands or yed, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's yed is when he says literal physical hand, they're thinking like two giant hands that are finite and have a particular size and shape and all this kind of stuff. This is the way he's presenting it. Oh, it's either like this or it's like this. Or do you think it's an attribute? Yeah, of course. My position anyway is that it's an attribute, but it's not like Father Christmas with two big hands in the sky type of deal. And look, it's obvious. I know I have to just be blunt and say this, that this was something that was fed to Bo as something to try to use in a polemical context. But Muslims don't believe in that. Sorry to tell you. I mean, you guys can go and produce all the videos you want, but the reality is the people who are feeding him this information don't really have any idea what the hell they're talking about. And it was really unfortunate to see Bo try to use that as part of it, because really it doesn't matter what attribute it is. It could be omniscience, it could be omnibenevolence. He could have ran his little argument with anything else, but it was clear there was a polemical context behind bringing this up. But
it's important to know that, like, obviously it's quite obvious where it's from, but like, nobody people will say it's literal. I mean, you would expect, like, someone like Dr. Branson, of all people, who's a philosopher, to be more nuanced as to what that implies, right? As opposed to people who just, like, take that statement and think, we got him, and they put a clip on YouTube when they really don't know what the hell is going on there. The idea is to think that implies some kind of
literal,
physicality.
They think literal means like a physical giant hand that is like finite size and shape.
Obviously they don't get all the nuance behind it. They don't get the theory of language that's behind the people who hold to these positions traditionally, and what that really implies, and the conversations and the back and forth about that, and how it really isn't what you're thinking. But the point is that, I mean, of all people, you'd expect someone like Bo to be more nuanced on that, and not think that there is a legitimate Muslim position, which is something that you discuss quite a lot, that holds to the idea that God has this physical hand. I mean, nobody legitimately holds to that position. No Orthodox position holds to that.
Yeah, not in the way that he's explaining it. So anyway, Lamb here says Salafi scholars have said that the yed is literal. Again, you have to understand what the context of that is. With all due respect, Lamb and Bo and whoever else you've listened to, you have no idea what it means when they say it's haqiqa, or that it's that is based on the zahir, or the fact that it's based on the apparent meaning, or it's a real, quote unquote, literal yed. You don't know what that means. It doesn't mean what you think it is. That it's this big Father Christmas hand in the sky, and it's got 5 fingers each for a finite shape and size. That's not what it means. You have to understand when for somebody like Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah is talking about it's haqiqa, or it's based on the zahir, or the apparent meaning of the text. That doesn't mean what you're implying from it, that it's a physical hand. And you're saying that he never made the claim that they are like physical hands. He asked me as one of the options, is it a literal physical hand? That's literally what he said. And I said, no. And I explained that it's an attribute, right? Which you didn't get to hear really my explanation yet.
You can believe it's physical, but unlike human hands. So that's not the point. The point is that, I mean, nobody says this, and it's not like whatever that means, who knows? No, it's just like you don't know. I mean, with all due respect, it's not that who knows as if
right. Yeah, we do know. We can explain it, but we're not going to do it here now anyway, because it's relevant to a debate coming up on this channel in about 10 days or so. But anyway, so let's see. I'm not going to keep engaging with Lamb, because I don't need to give him an Aqidah lesson here, with all due respect. So let me keep playing this here.
They're attributes.
They're attributes, okay. But they're distinct from God himself.
In what sense?
Meaning just God isn't a hand, or whatever.
They're not identical to him, but they're not separate. They're not separable.
Okay. So they're not identical, okay, but they're not separable. So there's, would you say there's been any time at which God was without these attributes?
No.
And so would you say that the attributes are created?
No. How would they be created?
It's not a trick question. I just want to make sure that I'm on the right page. So what about their existence in different possible worlds? Do you think there are possible worlds where God lacks those attributes?
No.
Okay. So those attributes, then it's safe to say, are necessarily existent. They're eternal and they're uncreated. Are they also Aseity?
Depends what you mean by that.
Are they in any sense caused or dependent on God, or are they just kind of independent things that aren't in any sense?
They're not independent of God.
Okay, so that you wouldn't say they're like absolutely Aseity beings, like
No.
Playing Craig with with his Cerberus Trinity or whatever. Okay, so then it seems like we've gotten the conclusion that necessary existence as such doesn't require aseity. Eternality as such doesn't require aseity. Uncreatedness as such doesn't require aseity. None of those three things in combination apparently requires aseity. Also, it seems like the sort of standard attributes you might think that God would have, like omniscience and omnibenevolence and omnipotence and so forth, don't just sort of by definition require aseity.
I'm not really following what you're saying, to be honest.
Well, just those. So none of those attributes requires.
Yeah, but how does it map onto the discussion? Because it seems to really be deviating from the discussion.
Right. So the question is, can you have the divine nature without aseity? It looks to me
yeah,
like
but
all of
that's not the same thing, though. When you talk about the hand of God, or you talk about the power, it's not a nature. It's not a divine nature. So it's not analogous at all. Yeah, so it's not analogous to what we're talking about.
Okay, I mean, it doesn't have to be analogous. I'm content to say there's no analogy, but.
So I say it's not analogous, and then I kind of explained why it's not analogous. And he says, "Oh, I'm content to say it's not analogous. If it's not analogous, then why are you bringing it up as if it's a point to make in the debate? It's just a silly point." Now I'll explain in a bit of detail once the cross-examination is over, more about what argument Bo is actually trying to make, and then I'll show why it doesn't work, and he even in his closing statement will basically admit that. But let's listen a bit further.
But in terms of just possibility and necessity, it seems like so none of God's kind of qualitative properties like omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence require aseity, and none of these kind of other existential properties like necessity, eternality, uncreatedness, those factors don't require aseity. So it looks like
I don't understand what the relevance is. You're talking about an
issue. The question is, can you have the divine nature without aseity? Another way to put that would be if you take whatever attributes God has, since you believe in God, you're going to say those are all compossible, right? And I'm just saying, well, would they be compossible if you got rid of the aseity part and put in the caused part, right? And it looks
they wouldn't.
like you're saying individually, all of those attributes would be consistent with a lack of aseity.
No,
so
I'm
I'd
not saying
like
that.
to know why
I'm not saying that.
combination. Okay,
I'm not saying that.
Yeah, let me hear what you do think. What are your thoughts on that?
I didn't say that at all, because the attributes are not something that is distinct from God. They are not things in themselves, which you're talking about. I really am lost with the relevance of this form of argumentation, because these are not separate, distinct ase beings that all possess the same divine nature.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm not arguing for that. Right. What I'm asking about is not the attributes themselves. What I'm asking about is these other properties. So the property of omniscience doesn't require aseity. So you could have omniscience in theory without aseity. You could have omnipotence without aseity. You could have omnibenevolence without aseity, so forth. You could be necessarily existent without aseity. You could be eternal. You could be uncreated without aseity. So those.
No, I don't think so. I'm not agreeing to that.
So notice I say that I'm not agreeing to that, because he's trying to say individually. And notice in the beginning he said, by definition, just the definition, does the definition require such and such? And then he's trying to move from my answers to that to then implying entailing necessarily a being that is metaphysical, concrete metaphysical being that can have all these properties and not be ase. That's not, I didn't admit to that at all. And so let's finish this here.
You don't think God's attributes are necessary and eternal and uncreated, but not ase?
I don't think that they can exist apart from him. You can't have a separation between God and his attributes and then have a discussion about separating them and this type of division. It's
right, so they're not ase, in other words.
No,
they're not separable.
my point to you is whether they're ase or not is irrelevant to what you're talking about, because they are not. We don't say that the power of God is God. We don't say that it has the power of God has the divine nature.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, but you're admitting that the property of existing in every possible world doesn't require aseity. In other words, let's just forget about property.
Yes, it does. It does, because there is no such thing that is an individual property which exists apart from God's essence. You're trying to separate it out as if there could be this floating property that would exist in every possible world.
Yeah, no, I don't think that. But so to just reiterate, right? Just take a proposition. Let's say an open sentence, I guess, to be more precise. But if X is necessarily existent, then X is ase. You would say, no, that's not right. That's not necessarily true. That open sentence.
Was that a question or
anything you plug into it? Yeah, do you agree with that?
Can you restate the question again?
Sentence. So the open sentence would be, if X exists necessarily, then X is ase. But if I plug the attributes in for X, then that's going to be false, right?
But I never stated that. We're talking about a being. We're not talking about
attributes were necessarily existent, but not Aseity.
No. Here's what I'm saying. Well, first of all, you asked me about one specific attribute. How you originally started off asking me about, where you're asking me about. No, it doesn't, because we make a distinction between God's attributes. So you're trying to make it seem like all of the attributes are the same. We wouldn't agree to that.
No, not. But I think my time.
Yeah. We're just now out of time. Okay. Although I feel like that was starting to get interesting. But now we'll move into the 5-minute closing remarks, and we'll start with.
Anyway, do you have any final comments on that? But because otherwise, I'm going to go to his closing statement, where he makes a statement about this again.
Yeah, just really quick. I mean, that's why it's important, because time and time again, I think you're going to mention this later again, right? But time and time again, some of our Christian friends try to always bring in the idea of attributes, because that's like, that's the that's their trump card, right? Always. That works. And then the idea is he's just presenting in the form of proposition, and if I just key in, they're just variables, right? So if X is necessary, then X is Aseity. Well, then the properties are necessary. I mean, that's really not how it works, right? So clearly, obviously, you didn't make that argument anyway. That necessity entails Aseity, but there is definitely a distinction between a property and a being that is described by properties and characteristics, right? So the idea of necessity as it relates to Aseity is not going to be related to, the Aseity of the properties that would necessarily have to describe whatever Aseity being there is. So it's just confusing categories and sort of oversimplifying it, and it's just trying to give me the contradiction, right? I just don't like that approach.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm skipping over my closing statement. I just gave a recap. You've heard everything that I've said for the past 3 hours, so I don't need to play any of that really. But I emphasize the same points in a summarized version of what we've been saying here. Bo goes on to talk about. He talks about a bunch of different things. You can listen to it, but one thing that's important is him basically, let me just play it for you. You can listen and then I'll explain it.
The disjunction of, and finally, to maybe explain or elaborate a little bit where I was going with those questions, Jake said he was a little confused. To say that it's possible for an object or an entity to exist is equivalent to saying that all of that thing's essential properties are compossible. That is to say, they're all they can be co-instantiated by the same thing. So that's just an equivalent way of sort of saying the same thing. And what I'm saying is, it sounds to me like Jake was admitting that omniscience is compossible with the lack of Aseity, omnipotence is compossible with the lack of Aseity, omnibenevolence is compossible with the lack of Aseity. So those.
Notice that I'm shaking my head no as he's saying that, because I never agreed to that.
Those properties themselves are in theory compossible with the lack of Aseity. And I understand that attributes aren't persons. I'm not saying that. I'm just talking about omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, then necessary existence, eternality, uncreatedness. All of those things individually, it sounds like, are compossible with the lack of Aseity. I'll give you an out here. I don't want to be a bully in the last 30 seconds here, but I understand you might say like, yeah, but there couldn't be an actual being, a hypostasis, as we call it, that would have all of those. But I would just say an out here. All of those things individually, it sounds.
Now notice what he says here. He says, I don't want to be a bully, but I'll give you an out here in the last couple minutes. And listen to his supposed out is exactly what I was saying during the cross-examination section. It's like, Bo, come on, dude. Were you just not listening? Or I don't know what kind of debate tactics he's wearing.
It's what he just said there is literally,
it's exactly what I was saying.
You have explicitly said what entails his position right now, that the attribute, the definition is consistent with the existence of Aseity or the lack of Aseity, as in there's no contradiction that's essentially entailed. But then your whole position is basically arguing that that's kind of irrelevant. That's not the point. That's not what we should be looking at. What we should be looking at is more like robustly possible metaphysical considerations, and he there again acknowledged that it could be different for a being, because obviously you're in a different category.
Yeah, but that's my whole point. That was my whole point, was saying
Exactly.
you can't look at the attributes in a box apart from the being, because we don't think those attributes can exist apart from the being, and whatever that being is that has those attributes also must necessarily be Ase, right? So he's trying to separate them. I'm saying he can't separate them.
I mean, in that sense, a being can't be Ase, because obviously it's not clear what kind of dependency he's talking about. But I mean, you're obviously just giving the simplest form of the response, which is like cooperative. But then it's just not clear how you can be Ase in that sense. So if he's talking about like counterfactual dependence, I mean, can there be anything that's Ase in that sense? By like, I don't know if that's what he means.
No, but he's not, bro. He's not talking about the being. He's not saying that Jake's model results in God not being Ase. That's not what he's saying.
Yeah, but then in that sense, if that's not what he's saying, I just don't get.
That's not what he's saying at all. That's not what he's saying at all.
Yeah.
That's not what he's saying at all. He's saying that because you have individually the property of omnipotence doesn't necessitate aseity, because the property of omniscience doesn't necessitate aseity, and you go on with all the properties, then he's saying, why, when you put those properties together in a being, does the being need to be Ase? That's what he's trying to say. He's not trying to argue that because God has these properties and the properties are not Ase, that they're dependent upon his being, that conflicts with it. He can't be saying that, because he rejects.
That's what he needs to say, though, and he needs to take the divine simplicity position.
No, he doesn't believe in divine simplicity. That's not his argument, though.
I know.
But that's what I'm saying.
It's just confusing. Yeah.
But no, bro. But this is my point.
He needs to uphold to divine simplicity. If he's making that argument, I know he isn't, but then this argument he's making is just completely irrelevant to the topic. And you've been arguing the whole time, literally what he just said. So it's just like, I just don't get the point at all.
I know, but Abdu, that's what I'm saying. That is his point, dude. He's not making the point, and this is what other people were confused about. Oh, Jake, that he's showing you that you believe that in God, and your God results in not being Ase. No, he's not saying that, because he clearly said that he believes that divine simplicity, absolute divine simplicity, is false for all the reasons that we would agree with, right? So he can't be making that argument. What he's saying is that because none of these properties individually entail aseity, then when you put them all together, why does a being that have them have to be ase? That's what he's saying. And then he goes on to make the distinction and say, oh, well, Jake, you could say, and I'll give you an out here, and I'm not trying to be a bully, but I'll give you an out here, and to say, well, that could be, it's about the properties, but not for a being to have them and not be ase. But yes, that's literally the distinction I made from the beginning, and why I said it was not analogous during the cross-examination section. So he's admitting inadvertently in his closing statement that my response to his argument in the closing state in his cross-examination section didn't work, because the out that he's supposedly giving me is my very answer of why I said that they were not analogous. Anyway, let's listen here to the rest of it.
Here, I don't want to be a bully in the last 30 seconds here, but I understand you might say like, yeah, but there couldn't be an out here. All of those things individually, it sounds like, are compossible with the lack of aseity. I'll give you an out here. I don't want to be a bully in the last 30 seconds here, but I understand you might say like, yeah, but there couldn't be an actual being, a hypostasis that would have all of those. But I would just say it needs further elaboration why each of these things individually is compossible with the lack of aseity, but yet you stick them together and put them together in a person, and for some reason they're not anymore. So that is just something we would need to kind of have more elaboration on. Maybe, again, for my part, I would love to continue the conversation. And
you see my point, Abdu? That proves that's exactly what his point is. It has nothing to do with divine simplicity or God not being ase on my model. It has to do with his claim. Well, why is it that, you can have these properties individually without aseity? Dude, because you asked me in a vacuum based on the definition. You didn't ask about the metaphysics of it. Can a being actually have those properties and not be ase? To that answer, I say no. And that's the whole point of the debate, right? So, and then he's acting as if he's giving me a way out to say that he's acting as if he's giving me a way out, but the way out that he's saying is the very thing that I've been arguing from the beginning of this entire debate. But anyway, that's the end of the entire debate. We've been going on for 3 hours now, so it's pretty detailed. Abdulrahman, I don't know if you're able to come back or not, but unfortunately, guys, this stream, I just want to be clear on what the point of the stream was. This stream was for the audience, Muslims and Christians who may have watched the debate or who will watch it in the future. Some points maybe have not been understood properly. Some people may have not had the full context around certain arguments that were being used, and even certain arguments that Bo made, like this one, and what he was trying to say and why the argument just quite frankly doesn't work, and why he himself admitted that it was not analogous. And the out that he's giving me, I already used in direct response to him anyway. So
before you move on, I just wanted to say real quick that it's I think his reasoning is even more troubling for his position, because there's nothing about the definition of Aseity that entails divinity, and you don't even need to add composition or anything, but for him it does entail divinity.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question is, how do you, and that's the whole question. He's saying, well, if it doesn't have it individually, then what's this necessary entailment in the being? And then that's what we're asking about, the same thing with the divine nature when it comes to his position. So,
and it's kind of even worse, because in his case, well, the Aseity, nothing in Aseity by definition entails divinity. And here you don't even need to add like a bunch of other properties and say that, well, what makes it entail divinity in this case? No, here the Aseity itself, nothing about it entails divinity, but at the same time, it does entail divinity for him. Like, there's no even like further composition required that will bring in that mysterious factor that you can apply for it and say there's like, there's a problem with the reasoning from part to whole or something. No, for him, it's just the part. So it's just the individual property of Aseity that doesn't, by definition. So if he literally asked him the same question, by definition, does Aseity entail divinity? Well, no. Well, then why does it entail divinity? That's kind of the point. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Not a lot, but enough people put up super chats and comments. We didn't get to address them because there was just so much to go through. I mean, it was a 2-hour debate, and we managed to go through the whole thing and most of the significant points in 3 hours. So that's pretty good, because usually it's at least double the time or more. But anyway, guys, I think we're going to leave it there. Sorry we couldn't engage with the audience as much. Somebody's asking, do you think you will debate him again? I said in my closing statement, I don't think so, because honestly, I don't have I haven't had a personal problem with Bo, but the way he handled this debate and some of the ways that I think he dealt with the issue, especially on my third argument, I do feel we're not really forthright, to say the least. And I don't know why he had that approach. So I don't think we'll be debating again. Allahu alam. Maybe we'll discuss it and figure it out. But I don't think that it really.
I feel like that's an important question to ask you as well. I mean, I think like halfway through the debate, or maybe more towards the end, it feels like you kind of like lost interest in the debate altogether. I mean, there's a bit of like a frustration there. I mean, I felt that because I felt frustrated with the approach, because I was looking forward to a good back and forth and actually engaging with arguments. But it feels like you did kind of like lose interest or something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any interest, because he, as I said, on the next debate, he's just going to say, well, Jake didn't prove it was impossible, and if it's possible, then it's necessary, and then just go through his argument. But then I'd just be going over the same exact points that I already made in this debate that he never really responded to anyway. So it would just be a replay of this debate rather than a new debate on the second topic that we would have discussed. So I don't really see too much fruit in having another debate at all, to be quite honest. Let me see. Okay. Anyway, I think that's it, guys. We do have a debate coming up, which let me see if I can actually show that on the screen. We have another debate coming up, which is between Dr. Khalil Andani and myself, which is going to be on June 16th. Where is it here? I don't know why it's not showing up here. Okay. 1 second. Trying to search it on YouTube and it's not coming up. It's weird. Okay, here it is. So let me see if I can share my screen so you guys can see it. Okay. So here it is. This is the debate. It's going to be debating Tawheed. It's with myself and Khalil Andani. I will be defending the Aseity Creed, and Khalil will be defending quote-unquote Islamic philosophy, but what he's really defending, or supposed to be defending anyway, is the Ismaili theology. He's an Ismaili, and he's supposed to be defending that particular theology. So that's supposed to take place not this coming Thursday, but the following Thursday, June 16th, at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which would be 6 p.m., I believe, 6 p.m. UK time. So look out for that in about 10 days or so. That should be interesting. And we want to thank you guys all again for watching. We're going to have some more streams, inshallah, coming out in the next couple months on some other stuff. We've been more so focused on these debates lately, but we want to get back to the actual streams and talking to some of you guys soon, inshallah. But Abdulrahman, do you have any last words, or should I just end it here?
No, I think this has been great. Thanks a lot. And yeah, you guys should look forward to our upcoming streams, inshallah.
All right, sounds good. Until next time, guys, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.